Hey there. Before we begin, you should be in a position that is comfortable to you, and you can let us know in the comments where in the world you are and what is the current time for you. In the chaotic wonderland that was 13th century Byzantium, the marketplace didn't just hum with activity, it positively roared. Trade here wasn't just a side hustle. It was the main event, and you, my friend, are smack dab in the middle of it. Merchants from all corners of the known world converged on Constantinople like moths to a flame, each with a caravan of dreams, packed with everything from spices to silk, and a few questionable deals in between. The Byzantine Empire was quite the trendsetter, a veritable Amazon of its day, way before Jeff Bezos decided to take over the universe. Now, if you're planning to make a living here, you better have your haggling game strong. Picture this. You're surrounded by a kaleidoscope of goods. Vivid purple silks from China, aromatic saffron with its weight in gold, and porcelain so fine you'd swear it might shatter at the sound of a sneeze. Byzantine merchants weren't just salespeople, they were the original influencers, spinning tales of exotic origins to justify sky-high prices. Trust me, those spices weren't just for flavour, they were currency, status symbols and, occasionally, reasons for a good old-fashioned brawl. But why was Constantinople the beating heart of trade? Well, it's all about location, location, location. Nestled snugly between Europe and Asia, this city was the ultimate crossroads, the point where East literally met West. We're talking about trade routes stretching thousands of miles, from the Silk Road to the Spice Islands. If you were a merchant, you'd find yourself rubbing elbows with Persian traders, Arab spice merchants, and European buyers, all vying for the best deals. The Byzantines knew how to play this game. They imposed taxes on goods passing through, filling their coffers faster than you could say import duty. Financially speaking, Byzantium was a big deal. Coins jingled like music, and the solidus, think of it as the Bitcoin of its day, was the currency of choice. These gold coins were so reliable, they were used from London to Baghdad. And if you think your taxes are bad, imagine paying a 10% levy just to bring your goods into the city. The empire's coffers were bulging, which was just as well, considering the constant need for funding wars, palaces, and the occasional lavish feast. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of trade. Not everyone was living the high life. The merchant class was a mixed bag, with some striking it rich and others barely scraping by. Contracts were as binding as they were bewildering, written in Greek or Latin, and sometimes both. You had to know your stuff, or risk a deal going south faster than a Byzantine retreat. And speaking of south, let's not forget the darker side of this bustling trade hub. While silk and spices were the glamour items, the trade in slaves was a grim reality. Human lives were bought and sold alongside spices and silk, a stark reminder that the marketplace was as much about profit as it was about people. So here you are, weaving through the chaos, clutching your goods and hoping today's the day you make a killing. Figuratively speaking, of course. The air is thick with the scent of spices and sweat. Deals are being made over cups of wine, and the world feels as vast as the imagination of the merchants who travelled from its every corner. Welcome to the Byzantine marketplace, where history is alive. Deals are struck, and fortunes are made or lost in the blink of an eye. But don't let the intoxicating aroma of exotic spices and the allure of dazzling silks fool you, friend. Behind every tantalizing display of wealth lay the Byzantine Empire's real powerhouse, the bureaucratic machine. Picture a Byzantine merchant not just as a charming salesman, but as a master tactician navigating a labyrinth of gold coins, Byzantine hyperpyra, tariffs and taxes. Oh yes, the romance of trade had a very pragmatic, paperwork-laden underbelly, and Constantinople was the capital of red tape long before modern governments turned it into an art form. First things first, let's talk currency. In the 13th century, the Byzantine economy was rocked by the hyperpyron, a gold coin introduced by Emperor Alexios I Komnenos around 1092. This coin was sturdier than your granny's fruitcake and held the empire's economy together like a well-made Byzantine mosaic. It replaced the older solidus, which had fallen from grace after a series of devaluations that would make even the most reckless 21st century central banker blush. The hyperpyron was so solid, it became the standard currency for over a century, accepted from the markets of Venice to the bazaars of Baghdad. Talk about street cred. But the hyperpyron was just the start. Byzantine merchants had to juggle multiple currencies like a circus performer with a penchant for financial acrobatics. You see, every visiting merchant, from the Venetian ducat-toting Italians to the silver dirham-dealing Arabs, brought their own money to the table. Our Byzantine merchant friends needed to be part trader, part currency exchange, and part mathematician just to keep up. The Byzantine mint was like a medieval Federal Reserve, churning out coins that could hold their own against foreign money, all while sending spies to check for counterfeiters. Because, of course, there were counterfeiters. There are always counterfeiters. Now, if you thought the currency game was complex, just wait until you dive into the Byzantine tax system. Imagine your average Byzantine merchant trying to offload a shipment of spices. Before they could even dream of making a profit, there was the komerkion, a 10% import tax slapped on goods entering the empire. And just when you think you've got it covered, along comes the epibole, a tax on land that merchants often had to pay indirectly through increased prices on local goods. It was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube with blindfolds on while juggling flaming torches. But wait, there's more. The Byzantine Empire had an entire buffet of taxes to choose from, each more delightful than the last. The kapnikon was a hearth tax, basically a fee for existing under a Byzantine roof. Then there's the sinon, a tax on certain provisions, and the tilania, collected at every market and harbour. If you think navigating modern tax forms is a nightmare, try doing it in Latin or Greek, while carrying a ledger as heavy as the family Bible. Byzantine merchants had to be as savvy with their paperwork as they were with their products, and heaven forbid they missed a payment. The fines were enough to make your hair stand on end. In this world of Byzantine bureaucracy, merchants had to employ every trick in the book to stay afloat. They forged alliances, greased palms, and sometimes bent the rules like a blacksmith working over a hot forge. Remember, this was a time when a strategic bribe could be as effective as a well-timed prayer, and knowing the right official in the right office could mean the difference between a thriving business and a financial shipwreck. While the Byzantine Empire was often portrayed as the epitome of opulence, its bureaucratic system was a beast of its own making. The intricate web of taxes and tariffs was designed to fill imperial coffers, but it also slowed down trade like a clogged artery. Still, merchants adapted, using their wits and connections to navigate these treacherous waters. After all, the allure of riches beyond one's wildest dreams was a powerful motivator. But remember, this wasn't just about the money. For Byzantine merchants, trade was a way of life, a calling, and an art form. It required shrewdness, perseverance, and a bit of luck. The romance of trade was alive and well, but only for those who could master the Byzantine dance of commerce. As you wander through the bustling marketplace, remember that behind every smiling merchant is a mind whirring with calculations, a heart beating with ambition, and a soul seeking not just profit, but a chance to navigate and, perhaps, outsmart the Byzantine system. As you continue to drift through the Byzantine marketplace, you can practically feel the air vibrating with the hum of history in the making. This isn't just a scene out of a medieval fairy tale, it's a vivid tapestry of human interaction, where class, religion, and culture collide like spices in a bustling stew pot. Forget any idea you have of merchants being exotic adventurers, constantly off on daring escapades. The reality was more like a Byzantine soap opera, with plenty of drama but way less glamour. Let's start with the people you'd meet here. Merchants were often viewed with a mix of awe and suspicion by their contemporaries. On one hand, their travels and tales brought the world to the Byzantine doorstep. On the other, they were sometimes seen as slippery characters, willing to bend the truth as much as any Byzantine tax code. Your typical 13th century merchant was more of a shrewd business person than a swashbuckling explorer. Think less Indiana Jones, more Wall Street Wolf. Minus the questionable ethics and high-octane lifestyle, arguably. The Byzantine marketplace was a medieval melting pot, a social cocktail shaken, not stirred. Picture Persian traders bartering over bolts of silk with Italian merchants, while Arab spice dealers haggled with Greeks over the price of saffron. It was a veritable United Nations of commerce, centuries before the actual UN became a thing. This cultural mashup wasn't just a backdrop, it was the engine powering Byzantine prosperity. Each trader brought their own traditions, languages, and religious practices, making Constantinople not just a city, but a crucible of cultures. But let's not put on rose-tinted glasses just yet. While it sounds harmonious, the reality was often a cacophony of competing interests. Merchants from different backgrounds didn't always play nice. Xenophobia wasn't just a modern phenomenon. Back then it was practically a competitive sport. People were quick to blame outsiders for economic woes, and merchants, being the most visible foreigners, often bore the brunt. It wasn't uncommon for tensions to flare into outright conflict, with traders needing to be as adept at diffusing a situation as they were at calculating exchange rates. The Byzantine social hierarchy added another layer of complexity. Merchants occupied a peculiar spot on the social ladder. They weren't peasants, but they weren't nobility either. Think of them as the middle management of medieval society. Some struck it rich and cozied up to the aristocracy, while others remained perpetually on the fringes, struggling to make ends meet. It was a classic tale of haves and have-nots, with merchants constantly navigating the razor-thin line between success and ruin. Religion was another ingredient in this Byzantine stew. The city was a bastion of Orthodox Christianity, yet it was home to Muslims, Jews, and pagans who brought their own spiritual practices into the mix. This religious diversity was both a strength and a source of tension. On the one hand, it enriched the cultural fabric of Constantinople. On the other, it was a powder keg, with religious differences sometimes sparking as much friction as the trade negotiations themselves. Merchants often had to be diplomats, smoothing over religious rifts while keeping their business interests afloat. Now, let's tackle the myth of the merchant's glamorous life of travel. Sure, some traders did embark on epic journeys, but it wasn't all sunsets and serenades. The road was long, treacherous, and rife with dangers ranging from bandits to Byzantine bureaucracy. Picture a caravan snaking through the rugged terrain, its merchants more worried about the toll of travel on their goods and themselves than the thrill of adventure. When they weren't on the road, they were in the marketplace, dealing with the daily grind of commerce, haggling over prices and navigating the Byzantine tax maze with all the enthusiasm of someone trying to solve a particularly nasty crossword puzzle. And let's not forget those who stayed closer to home. Many merchants spent their days anchored in the marketplace, managing stalls and dealing with the mundane reality of inventory, supply chains, and customer complaints. Being a merchant was less about the romance of the open road and more about the nitty-gritty of running a business. They were akin to modern-day small business owners, juggling books, negotiating deals, and occasionally losing sleep over fluctuating market prices. Despite these challenges, merchants were indispensable to the Byzantine economy. They were the arteries through which the lifeblood of trade flowed, pumping wealth, innovation, and cultural exchange into the empire. They were also the original networkers, building connections across continents long before LinkedIn made it a digital affair. In this way, they were the unsung heroes of the Byzantine story, their contributions often overlooked in favor of more glamorous historical narratives. Yet, in the swirling chaos of the marketplace, these merchants carved out a world of their own, a world defined by resilience, resourcefulness, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. In doing so, they helped shape the Byzantine Empire into a beacon of trade and culture, a legacy that would resonate long after the stalls had closed and the merchants had moved on. So, the next time you're haggling over a deal or navigating the complexities of modern commerce, spare a thought for these medieval forerunners. Their story is ours, a testament to the timeless dance of trade that continues to shape our world today. As you weave through the bustling throng, take note. The Byzantine marketplace is far from a static historical relic. It's a living testament to the complexities of human nature, a place where ambition, culture, and commerce collide in a dance as ancient as the empires themselves. And while the merchants may not have lived out the romantic adventures we often imagine, they were the cornerstone of an empire, navigating a world as complex and multifaceted as any we face today. But the Byzantine marketplace wasn't just a cauldron of trade and culture. It was also a geopolitical chessboard where merchants found themselves as unwitting pawns in a game played by emperors and kings. Picture this: the Byzantine Empire, caught in a perpetual dance with its neighbors, each move a calculated step in the grand strategy of medieval power. This wasn't just about selling spices and silks. It was about navigating the turbulent waters of international diplomacy, where one wrong step could sink a merchant's fortunes faster than a leaky Byzantine dromon in a storm. Byzantium, perched strategically between Europe and Asia, was forever in the crosshairs of ambitious rulers. Its neighbors were an eclectic bunch, Venetians, Normans, Bulgarians and Seljuk Turks, each with their own agenda and each ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. For merchants, this was a high-stakes game with no instruction manual, just a dizzying array of alliances and betrayals. The empire's political landscape was like a Byzantine mosaic, intricate, beautiful, but perilously easy to crack. Let's delve into a concrete example, the Fourth Crusade, that infamous detour in medieval history where Western knights, originally en route to the Holy Land, decided to make a pit stop at Constantinople in 1204. Why the change of plans? Well, like many good stories, it involved money, politics, and a dash of opportunism. The Venetians, those shrewd maritime merchants, saw an opportunity to knock Byzantium down a peg and boost their trading position. They convinced the Crusaders to redirect their holy mission, and the result was catastrophic, a sacking of Constantinople that left the city in ruins. For merchants, this was akin to a financial apocalypse. Trade routes were disrupted, goods were looted, and the Byzantine economy took a nosedive that would make Wall Street blush. Imagine being a merchant who had just stocked up on precious silks, only to find your warehouse in flames and your financial future as solid as Greek fire. Yet merchants are a resilient breed. Those who survived the chaos adapted, shifting their operations to other burgeoning trade hubs like Venice or Alexandria, proving once again that necessity is the mother of reinvention. The political aftermath of the Fourth Crusade was like watching a Game of Thrones unfold in real time. The Byzantine Empire was fractured, with rival factions vying for control. The Latin Empire held Constantinople, while Byzantine loyalists regrouped in Nicaea and Epirus. For merchants, this meant a constantly shifting landscape of allegiances and tariffs, a veritable minefield for those trying to keep their businesses afloat. Trade agreements were rewritten more often than a Byzantine scribe's manuscript, and merchants had to be as nimble as acrobats to navigate this ever-changing terrain. But why did merchants bother with Byzantine politics in the first place? Well, aside from the obvious financial incentives, there was the matter of protection. A well-placed bribe or a strategic alliance could mean the difference between a safe passage and a bandit attack on the road to Antioch. Think of it as paying for medieval insurance, except instead of a policy, you had a promise from a local warlord or a Byzantine official. And just like modern insurance, the payout wasn't always guaranteed. The Byzantine diplomatic playbook was legendary. It wasn't all about swords and sieges, it was also about marriages, treaties, and a healthy dose of espionage. Merchants, ever the pragmatists, often found themselves acting as unofficial diplomats, using their trade connections to gather intelligence or broker peace deals. It was a risky business, but the rewards were substantial: land grants, tax exemptions, and the ever-elusive imperial favour. Now, let's talk numbers. In the 13th century, a single Venetian ducat could buy you enough grain to feed a family for a month, while a Byzantine merchant's wealth was often measured in hyperpyra, the gold coin that was the backbone of their economy. Trade wasn't just about the goods themselves, but the currencies that facilitated these exchanges. Merchants had to be fluent in the language of money, constantly converting, negotiating, and hedging their bets in a volatile market that was as unpredictable as Byzantine politics. And let us not forget the human element. Behind every trade route was a story: a Byzantine merchant who risked it all for a cargo of spices, a Venetian trader navigating the intricacies of Byzantine court politics, or a humble peddler trying to eke out a living in the shadow of empires. These were the people who lived the history we now study, whose choices and sacrifices shaped the world in ways we are only beginning to understand. So, as you wander through this Byzantine tapestry of commerce and politics, remember that the merchants of Constantinople weren't just traders. They were survivors, innovators, and sometimes reluctant diplomats. They moved through a world defined by its uncertainties, where the only constant was change itself. They lived by their wits, thrived on their resilience, and, in their own way, left a legacy that echoes through the corridors of history. Stay tuned, because the story of Byzantium and its merchants isn't over yet. There's more to uncover in this grand saga of ambition, intrigue, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. As we draw the curtain on our Byzantine bazaar, it's time to explore how these medieval merchants left a mark as indelible as a coffee stain on your favourite shirt. You see, the Byzantine traders were the unsung heroes of the commercial world. the medieval middlemen who set the stage for the global economy we navigate today. They were the original risk-takers, the trailblazers who laid the groundwork for modern commerce with a blend of grit, guile, and gold. First up, let's talk about those trade practices. Byzantine merchants were the masters of negotiation, and their methods were as intricate as the iconography that adorned their churches. They perfected the art of haggling, turning it into a high-stakes game of wits. In a time when a deal could make or break you, they understood the value of compromise and cunning, skills that any modern-day negotiator would kill to have. The Byzantine approach to trade was a balancing act of diplomacy and deception, where knowing when to hold 'em and when to fold 'em wasn't just a catchy line from a country song, but a survival skill. And then there's the not-so-small matter of their financial acumen. These merchants were the original venture capitalists, investing in long-distance trade routes that were the equivalent of 13th century startups. They took on risks that would make the most daring Silicon Valley investor break into a cold sweat. A single shipment could cost a small fortune, with a merchant laying down 100 hyperpyra for a cargo of silk, hoping it would triple in value by the time it reached the markets of Venice or Alexandria. In today's terms, it's akin to betting the farm on Bitcoin, only the stakes were often a matter of life and death. What about innovation, you ask? Well, Byzantine merchants were logistical geniuses. They pioneered trade routes that spanned continents, making the Silk Road look like a Sunday stroll. The Byzantine Empire's strategic location enabled it to act as a bridge between East and West. This wasn't just about moving goods, it was about moving ideas, technologies, and yes, even plagues. The cross-pollination of cultures that occurred on these trade routes sowed the seeds for the Renaissance, a historical plot twist that would have never happened without these enterprising merchants laying the groundwork. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The romantic notion of the merchant as a swashbuckling adventurer is about as accurate as calling a tax audit a thrill ride. The reality was far grittier: long waits at border crossings, Byzantine bureaucracy thicker than your grandma's gravy, and the ever-present threat of losing it all to bandits or bad weather. Yet, it's precisely this blend of romance and reality that keeps their stories alive in our imagination. We love the idea of the daring merchant, partly because it's a narrative that lets us dream big while confronting the harshness of human ambition. Their tales also resonate because they mirror the challenges we face today. The Byzantine merchants had to navigate complex trade agreements and shifting political landscapes, much like today's businesses deal with international regulations and trade wars. The parallels are uncanny, reminding us that while technology evolves, human nature remains as constant as a Byzantine mosaic. The merchant's ability to adapt and thrive amidst chaos is a lesson in resilience that's as relevant now as it was back then. So, what's the legacy of these medieval entrepreneurs, you ask? Well, their influence is woven into the very fabric of modern commerce. The Byzantine system of tariffs and taxes laid the foundation for economic policies that govern our world today. Their trade networks prefigured the global supply chains that keep our shelves stocked and our economies ticking. Even the Byzantine penchant for dealing in multiple currencies is echoed in today's complex forex markets. In reflecting on Merchants' Day, we see a microcosm of this enduring legacy. It's a day that celebrates not just the act of commerce, but the spirit of entrepreneurship that drives it. It highlights how these medieval merchants were more than just cogs in the Byzantine machine. They were innovators who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Their legacy is a reminder that trade is not just about the exchange of goods, but about the exchange of ideas, cultures, and aspirations. As we wrap up this journey through the Byzantine marketplace, let's acknowledge these merchants for what they were: pioneers in a world that was as unpredictable and unforgiving as any you can imagine. They navigated the currents of commerce with a deftness that would make modern traders look like amateurs. Their legacy is a testament to the enduring power of trade to shape societies, economies, and histories. So, next time you find yourself haggling over a price or strategizing a business deal, remember those Byzantine merchants. They laid the groundwork for our modern world with nothing more than their wits, a handful of hyperpyra, and the relentless determination to turn the chaos of the marketplace into opportunity. Their story is our story, a continuous dance of trade and transformation that began in the bustling streets of Constantinople and continues to this day. and as long as there are goods to trade and fortunes to be made, their legacy will endure, echoing through the ages as a reminder of what it means to be a merchant in a world forever on the move. Alexander the Great, a name that conjures images of a young conqueror galloping across ancient landscapes, leaving a trail of awe and confusion in his wake. But let's hit pause on the battlefield glory reel and zoom in on something a tad more mundane, yet equally fascinating, his diet. Now, before you get carried away with visions of endless feasts, goblets overflowing with wine, and tables groaning under the weight of delicacies, let's just say the reality was a bit less Instagrammable. First off, the myth. Alexander's supposed to be this demigod figure who could guzzle wine like water and indulge in feasts that would make Henry VIII look like a Weight Watchers ambassador. Ancient sources like Plutarch and Athenaeus paint a picture of opulence, with descriptions of lavish banquets that could have doubled as Olympic events. They tell stories of Alexander and his generals lounging around tables laden with exotic fruits, roasted meats, and enough wine to float a small ship. Sounds grand, right? Until you consider the logistics. Welcome to the harsh reality of campaign life, where the real feast was the daily grind of feeding an army of 40,000 men. Picture trying to organize a picnic for a football stadium packed with soldiers, and you're on the right track. Alexander's men required mountains of supplies, and we're not just talking about a couple of sandwiches and a flask of tea. Each soldier needed about 3 pounds of grain per day. Multiply that by 40,000 and you're looking at a staggering 60 tons of grain daily. And that's just breakfast, folks. Toss in another pound of meat and 2 pints of wine or beer per soldier, and you start to see why logistics was Alexander's real Herculean task. Now, who footed the bill for this ancient buffet? The answer, unsurprisingly, involves a hefty dose of economic impact and a dash of political manoeuvring. As Alexander's conquests expanded, so did his need to keep the supply lines flowing. This wasn't just about feeding troops, it was about maintaining morale, keeping the machine well-oiled. The cost of such an operation was staggering, draining the coffers of conquered territories and often leaving local economies in shambles. It's no wonder that Alexander wasn't always met with open arms and confetti upon entering new lands. The Macedonian king wasn't just a warlord, he was an inadvertent economic disruptor. By some accounts, the cost of provisioning his army could reach tens of thousands of drachmas a day. To put that in perspective, a single drachma was about a day's wage for a skilled worker. Imagine your boss announcing that your entire paycheck and everyone else's is going to feed a bunch of distant soldiers. Not the kind of news that earns you Employee of the Month. And then there's the myth-busting kicker. Alexander himself wasn't quite the gluttonous feaster his legends suggest. In fact, he was known for his relatively ascetic lifestyle. Plutarch tells us that Alexander often ate simply, with a preference for modest meals over lavish banquets. He even had a habit of sleeping with a copy of Homer's Iliad tucked under his pillow rather than a turkey leg. This was a man more interested in conquering territories than menus, which makes sense given the calorie-burning demands of world domination. But why the extravagant tales, you ask? Well, ancient historians had a flair for the dramatic, often portraying their subjects as larger-than-life figures. It's the classic case of never letting the truth get in the way of a good story. And let's admit it, the idea of Alexander as a party-loving conqueror is way more fun than picturing him counting sacks of grain. So, while the myth of Alexander's diet fills our imaginations with images of bacchanalian excess, the truth lies in the disciplined, grueling logistics of feeding an army on the move. The real marvel wasn't the feasting, but the meticulous planning and economic manipulation required to keep his troops fed. As the story unfolds, we'll dive deeper into the culinary chaos that trailed Alexander across continents, but for now, chew on this. The next time you grab a quick bite on the run, spare a thought for Alexander's army, who redefined the term fast food in their relentless march across the known world. And speaking of fast food, let's dig into the actual menu of the ancient Macedonian army. Not exactly what you'd find at your local drive-thru. We're talking about a culinary landscape that was as much about survival as it was about taste. When Alexander and his troops weren't busy redefining borders, they were relying on a diet that seemed to have been curated by a Spartan minimalist, grain, more grain, and the occasional sprinkle of grain. To keep things interesting, let's start with the basics. Grain was the backbone of the Macedonian diet, much like bread and pasta are for many today. barley and wheat were staples, and soldiers would typically carry a stash of these grains, ready to be transformed into a kind of unleavened bread or gruel. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a power bar, but with fewer flavor options and not a single superfood in sight. It said that each soldier was entitled to approximately 3 pounds of grain per day. That's a lot of dough, literally. Now, let's talk protein. Meat was a luxury and not a guaranteed part of the everyday meal. When meat did make its way onto the menu, it was usually something like goat or sheep, animals that could be herded along with the army. Poultry and pork were less common. After all, chickens aren't exactly known for their long-distance marching capability. But in a pinch, anything that could be hunted or gathered was fair game. That's right, folks. Alexander's troops were the original locavores, dining on whatever the local ecosystem had to offer. Speaking of local flavors, Alexander's conquests weren't just a geopolitical reshuffling, they were also a gastronomic tour. As the army swept through Asia Minor and into Persia, they encountered new foods that occasionally made their way into the soldier's diet. Imagine the thrill or horror of the first Macedonian soldier who bit into a date, expecting it to taste like the figs back home. Exotic fruits like dates and pomegranates were introduced into their diet, adding a splash of colour to an otherwise beige food palette. But let's not romanticize it too much. The logistics of feeding an army on the move were staggering, and local cuisine didn't always mean new and exciting flavours. Often, it was about using whatever was available to stave off starvation. This meant long supply lines, with wagons creaking under the weight of grains, dried meats, and perhaps, if they were lucky, a few amphorae of wine. The roads behind Alexander's army were like the world's first food trucks, minus the artisanal branding. And wine, let's not forget the wine. This was less about savouring a fine vintage and more about practicality. Water was often contaminated, and beer didn't travel well, so wine was the hydration method of choice. Each soldier received roughly 2 pints a day, not exactly a Napa Valley tasting flight, but enough to keep spirits buoyed and maybe, just maybe, to help ignore the blistering heat and the endless marching. Now, transporting all this was no small feat. Picture supply trains stretching for miles, manned by an army of non-combatants, cooks, wagon drivers, and grooms, each one as vital to Alexander's success as the warriors themselves. These logistics wizards ensured that the army was never too far from its next meal, an incredible feat when you consider the distances covered. We're talking about a supply chain that rivaled modern multinational corporations, minus the spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. The real twist, though, is the influence of local cuisines on Alexander's own eating habits. As he conquered new territories, he was exposed to a world of flavours that would have been alien to him back in Macedonia. The spices of India, the rich stews of Persia, even the olive oils and wines of the Mediterranean all played a role in broadening his palate. While his diet remained relatively simple compared to the lavish tales spun by historians, Alexander was nonetheless a culinary bridge builder, bringing together diverse food traditions under the banner of his empire. In essence, Alexander's campaigns were as much about cultural exchange as they were about conquest. The foodstuff available during his time provides a tantalizing glimpse into a world where culinary diversity was emerging, albeit slowly and often under the duress of military necessity. As we continue to explore the impact of these Epicurean adventures, remember that the real story is not just in the food, but in how it reflects the larger narrative of a world in flux, a reminder that even in the march of war, there's always room for a taste of the exotic. And speaking of the exotic, let's dive headfirst into one of the juiciest myths surrounding Alexander the Great, his supposed penchant for drinking himself into oblivion. Now, if ancient gossip was to be believed, Alexander was the original party animal, a rock star in a world without electric guitars. Wrap your mind around that image for a moment. It's like picturing a toga-clad Mick Jagger leading an army instead of a band. The tale of Alexander's drinking prowess is one for the ages, but was it fact or just the ancient equivalent of clickbait? Plutarch and Athenaeus, our ancient TMZ reporters, certainly enjoyed painting him as a lush. They shared stories of wild banquets where Alexander would challenge his generals to drinking contests that usually ended with someone passed out on a marble floor. It was like an ancient frat party, but with more laurels and fewer red solo cups. But let's sober up for a second and question, did Alexander really drink himself to death? The story goes that after one particularly epic drinking session, he was struck down by a mysterious illness, which led to his untimely demise at the ripe old age of 32. But hold your goblets. There's more to the story. Some historians argue that it wasn't the wine that did him in, but rather a fever, possibly typhoid or malaria. Others suggest poisoning, because what's a good historical tale without a touch of Agatha Christie intrigue? Ancient texts mention a 12-day fever that kept Alexander bedridden, hardly the result of a hangover, no matter how epic the binge. But the image of Alexander as a booze-loving demigod is hard to shake. Why? Because the truth is often less glamorous than the legend. And let's face it, nobody throws a parade for the guy who dies quietly from a mosquito bite. Now, why the emphasis on his drinking habits? In the ancient world, feasting and drinking were more than mere indulgence. They were political theatre. A banquet was a stage where power was displayed, alliances were forged, and enemies were subtly insulted by seating them next to the guy who always double-dipped in the hummus. Alexander's symposia were no different. They were a mix of strategy meeting and social networking event, with a side of Dionysian revelry. In this boozy milieu, the king's ability to drink might have been exaggerated as a symbol of his power. Imagine the PR spin. Alexander the Great, conqueror of worlds, defeater of armies, and master of the wine goblet. It's a narrative that reinforces his image as a larger-than-life figure. And in a world where strength and excess were often equated, the tales of his drinking prowess fed into the cult of personality that surrounded him. But here's the kicker. Alexander himself was reportedly more restrained than the legends suggest. Accounts note that he often drank less than his companions, preferring to keep a clear head. It's the kind of myth-busting detail that makes you wonder if the stories were less about him and more about the glorification of the Macedonian lifestyle. Now, let's not ignore the social and political functions of these feasts. They were critical to maintaining the loyalty and morale of his officers. Wine flowed like water because it was safer than actual water, and it helped grease the wheels of camaraderie. It was also a handy tool for keeping dissent at bay. After all, it's hard to plot a coup when you're struggling to remember where you left your sandals. Feasting also served as a cultural bridge. As Alexander's campaign cut a swath through Asia, these gatherings became a melting pot of customs and cuisines. The blending of Greek and Eastern traditions at these events symbolized the new world order Alexander was crafting. Imagine the cultural exchange happening over roasted lamb and fermented grape juice. It was globalization before the term existed, and Alexander was its poster boy. Yet despite these grand affairs, the reality of campaign life was far from glamorous. Picture a dusty tent filled with sweaty soldiers, far removed from the opulent halls of Babylon. The logistics of organizing such events were nightmarish. Not only did you need enough food and drink to satisfy thousands, but you also had to entertain, inspire, and strategically outmaneuver your rivals, all while avoiding the temptation to drink yourself into a stupor. In essence, Alexander's legendary drinking habits were less about personal indulgence and more about maintaining the illusion of divine favor and invincibility. It's the kind of myth that serves a purpose beyond mere storytelling, reinforcing the leader's image while providing a veneer of continuity in an ever-changing world. As we continue to explore the complexities of Alexander's diet and lifestyle, it's essential to keep peeling back the layers of myth and legend. There's always more beneath the surface, a reminder that history is both a story and a puzzle, one where the pieces don't always fit neatly, but the picture they create is endlessly fascinating. So, as we lift our metaphorical goblets to Alexander, let's sip on the truth, savouring the harsh realities and the seductive myths alike. And stay tuned, because the feast is far from over. Alexander the Great's feasting habits didn't just leave behind a trail of empty amphorae and grain sacks, they also carved out economic and social shockwaves that rippled across his vast empire. Imagine an ancient world suddenly thrust into a culinary blender, where the ingredients were entire cultures, and Alexander was the one hitting puree. First, let's tackle the economic juggernaut that was Alexander's army. Feeding 40,000 men wasn't just about keeping them alive. It was a daily exercise in empire-wide logistics that would make Amazon's delivery network look like a neighborhood bake sale. These soldiers needed sustenance, and that meant local economies along the march were commandeered into action, whether they liked it or not. When Alexander came to town, he didn't just bring an army, he brought a mobile marketplace, a bustling bazaar that demanded everything from grain to livestock, often at prices not set by supply and demand, but by the pointy end of a spear. The economic impact was profound. In regions like Persia and Egypt, the demand for foodstuffs skyrocketed, causing local prices to inflate faster than a balloon at a child's birthday party. It's estimated that during major campaigns, the cost of feeding the army could reach astronomical figures. Think of it as a billion-dollar buffet, ancient style. In monetary terms, the daily expense could be upwards of 30,000 drachmas. For perspective, that's like burning through the GDP of a small city every day, all to keep the war machine running. And speaking of economic headaches, let's talk supply chains. Transporting food across Alexander's ever-expanding empire required an intricate network of roads and rivers, turning once sleepy trade routes into bustling arteries of commerce. These routes weren't just about moving soldiers and supplies, they became the lifeblood of regional economies. Towns along the way saw booms in business as traders and suppliers flocked to cash in on the hungry hordes. But, as with any boom, there was a bust. Once the army moved on, many communities were left to deal with the aftermath. A sudden drop in demand and a surplus of goods with no buyers. It's the ancient equivalent of a tech bubble burst with grain instead of gadgets. But wait, there's more. Alexander's omnivorous army didn't just consume resources, they absorbed cultures. As they marched, they encountered new cuisines, spices, and cooking techniques, creating a melting pot of gastronomic innovation. This wasn't always a smooth transition. Picture a Macedonian soldier encountering spicy Indian cuisine for the first time. More than one must have had a fiery surprise at dinner time. Yet, these encounters slowly started blending into the palate of the empire. Persian spices, Egyptian grains, and Indian fruits began to appear in the diets of those who had once subsisted solely on barley and goat. While some might call it culinary assimilation, others could see it as a kind of ancient globalization, with Alexander as the unwitting ambassador of fusion cuisine. However, not everyone was thrilled with this cultural exchange. In many regions, the imposition of Greek dining customs and food preferences led to tensions. Local populations often found themselves having to adapt to foreign tastes imposed by their new overlords. It was like a Yelp review gone wrong, with entire communities forced to change their menus overnight. The social consequences were significant. Food, after all, is a cornerstone of cultural identity. When that is threatened or altered, it can lead to resentment and resistance. Yet, amid the culinary chaos, there were some surprising benefits. The integration of diverse food practices led to increased agricultural knowledge and innovation. Farmers began experimenting with new crops and techniques, leading to richer harvests and more resilient food supplies. The agricultural landscape of the Mediterranean and Near East was forever changed, with crops like rice and citrus fruits spreading far beyond their native lands. It's a testament to the resilience of human creativity in the face of upheaval, proving that sometimes the best dishes come from a little bit of chaos. But let's not get too romantic about it. While it sounds like a foodie's dream, the reality was often harsh. For every new flavor discovered, there were countless communities left struggling to adapt. The process of culinary integration was as much about survival as it was about innovation. Many faced economic hardship as they tried to adjust to the new world order, where their traditional ways of life were upended by an insatiable army and its equally voracious leader. In the end, Alexander's diet and feasting habits were more than just a matter of personal preference or logistical necessity. They were a microcosm of his entire campaign, a relentless drive for expansion that left a lasting mark on the world. The culinary changes he brought about were a testament to the interconnectedness of empire, a reminder that even the most mundane aspects of life, like food, can become instruments of power and change. As we wrap up this chapter, don't put down your fork just yet. The story of Alexander's gastronomic adventures continues, and there's still more to chew on. In the coming sections, we'll delve deeper into the human stories behind these historical feasts, looking at how individuals and communities navigated the turbulent waters of change. So, stay tuned, because if history has taught us anything, it's that there's always room for another course. Alexander's culinary legacy isn't just about what was on the menu, it's about how his conquest reshaped the table itself. Let's chew on this. The man who preferred simple meals over opulent banquets inadvertently set the stage for a gastronomic revolution. His campaigns became cultural crossroads where food traditions collided, blended, and sometimes battled it out for dominance. But did his globe-trotting really change the world's menu forever? It's time to separate the grain from the chaff. While Alexander's armies feasted on the fly, consuming whatever local fare they could muster, the long-term effects of their culinary escapades were more profound than a hastily eaten meal. In the march toward empire, Alexander unwittingly became a culinary ambassador, leaving behind a legacy that went far beyond the battlefield. It's like an ancient version of Chopped, where the secret ingredient was global domination. Take spices, for example. Before Alexander, the Greeks weren't exactly known for their adventurous palates. Think about it, a diet heavy on barley, olives, and the occasional fish. But as the Macedonian army sliced through Persia and dipped its toes into India, they encountered spices that would make even the most seasoned chef raise an eyebrow. Cardamom, turmeric, and cinnamon. These weren't just flavors, they were status symbols, coveted as much as gold or silk. Suddenly, the spice trade was hotter than Hades, with these aromatic treasures making their way back to the Mediterranean, forever altering the culinary landscape. But it wasn't just spices. Alexander's conquests brought forth a cornucopia of crops and foods that would eventually become staples in the West. Take rice, for instance. Previously an exotic grain from the Far East, it began to weave its way into the diets of those living in the shadow of the Macedonian Empire. And let's not forget sugarcane, a sweet game-changer that started its journey from India to the Mediterranean, sweetening everything from porridge to politics. However, before you start picturing Alexander as the original culinary influencer, remember that the reality was a bit messier. Feeding an army on the move was less about gourmet meals and more about what could be carried, preserved, and consumed without much fuss. The logistics were a nightmare. Imagine trying to coordinate a daily meal plan without the aid of modern technology or supply chains. It's a wonder the soldiers weren't perpetually hangry. And here's a fun fact to nibble on. The ancient world didn't have the luxury of refrigeration. No ice cream socials or chilled Pinot Grigio here. Instead, food preservation was an art form, relying on salting, drying, and smoking to keep hunger at bay. This necessity led to the spread of techniques that would form the backbone of food storage for centuries to come. Think of it as one of the less glamorous, but immensely practical, legacies of Alexander's campaigns. Now, let's dig into the economic context. The influx of new foods and ingredients was not just a culinary revelation, it was an economic reshuffling on an epic scale. Local economies had to adapt to the new demand for exotic ingredients, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for what we might recognize today as global trade networks. This was no small feat. We're talking about thousands of miles of trade routes, bustling with merchants who were just as likely to swap recipes as they were to barter goods. But not all changes were welcomed with open arms. As Alexander's empire expanded, so did Greek cultural dominance, often at the expense of local traditions. The imposition of Greek dining customs was sometimes met with resistance, as many communities clung to their culinary identities. Yet, over time, the lines blurred, and a new hybrid cuisine began to emerge, one that reflected the diverse tapestry of Alexander's empire. It's a reminder that food is as much about identity as it is about sustenance. As we wrap up this culinary journey, let's turn to the primary sources for a moment. In the words of Plutarch, Alexander preferred a plain and simple diet, a testament to his Spartan sensibilities. Yet, the legends that sprouted from his campaign speak to something more profound. The idea that food is both a weapon and a bridge, capable of conquering hearts and minds just as effectively as any army. So, what's the takeaway from Alexander's culinary escapades? It's a tale of two realities, the romanticized vision of a banquet-hopping conqueror and the gritty truth of logistical nightmares and economic upheaval. The real legacy of Alexander's diet isn't in the dishes themselves, but in the way they symbolize the messy, interconnected world he helped create. It's a world where the boundaries of culture and cuisine were forever altered, where the exchange of ideas and flavors became as valuable as any territorial conquest. In conclusion, Alexander the Great might not have set out to change the world's menu, but his legacy is a testament to the power of food as a universal language. As you ponder the stories of his campaigns, remember that the truth often lies in the crumbs left behind. So, whether you're enjoying a fragrant curry or a simple loaf of bread, give a nod to the young conqueror who, through his relentless quest for glory, inadvertently set the table for a more interconnected world. And as we close the book on Alexander's culinary chapter, let's raise a glass, not of wine, but of truth, to the complex, often chaotic history that continues to shape our world today. Cheers to the past and to the flavors that bind us. In the bustling salons of revolutionary France, political acrobats were a dime a dozen, but Charles Maurice de Talleyrand was in a league of his own, a political Houdini with a well-rehearsed disappearing act. Born in 1754 to a family with more titles than a library shelf, young Talleyrand seemed destined for a life of noble leisure. But fate, with its characteristic irony, had other plans, and it all started with a rather unceremonious tumble. The story goes that a childhood accident left Talleyrand with a limp that would make any catwalk model envious. It was this very limp that hinted at his future path, not one of military glory, but of ecclesiastical scheming. You see, in the 18th century, a limp wasn't just a physical defect, it was a career path. The Talleyrand's, like many noble families, were keen on keeping their fortune firmly in the family clutches. So, instead of handing young Charles a sword, they handed him a cassock. Off to the clergy he went, not out of devout piety, but rather to secure a steady income and a comfortable spot in the family ledger. Now, don't get it twisted. Talleyrand's entry into the church was less about divine calling and more about divine calculation. He was a bishop by the age of 35, a position that wasn't just about waving incense but also about wielding influence. The church was, after all, a sanctuary for the politically astute. Talleyrand used his ecclesiastical role not as a step towards sainthood, but as a stepping stone to power. And boy, did he step cleverly. The French Revolution was the ultimate test of survival skills, and Talleyrand passed with flying colours, or perhaps, more aptly, with flying flags, given the number of regimes he managed to cozy up to. But before we dive into his revolutionary antics, let's pause to appreciate the cunning craftsmanship of his early manoeuvres. Talleyrand's life was a masterclass in turning lemons into lemonade, or perhaps more accurately, turning a limp into leverage. While most of his peers were losing their heads, quite literally, Talleyrand was busy losing himself in the art of political reinvention. He had a knack for knowing which way the wind blew and, crucially, when to change sails. This wasn't just opportunism, it was survival instinct honed to perfection. In a world where alliances shifted faster than a Parisian fashion trend, Talleyrand's ability to adapt was nothing short of miraculous. Now, let's address the myth of Talleyrand as the quintessential villain in a cloak. It's tempting to paint him as a Machiavellian mastermind, lurking in the shadows with a sinister grin. In reality, he was more of a pragmatic chameleon, blending in just enough to stay relevant without drawing too much ire. His reputation for being duplicitous was both deserved and exaggerated. Like most good stories, it was embellished with a touch of dramatic flair. Talleyrand's early life set the stage for a career that would defy expectations and survive the kind of political upheaval that would send lesser men running for the hills. He was a master at reading the room, or rather, reading the country. Whether it was serving under Louis XVI, the revolutionary government, Napoleon, or the restored monarchy, Talleyrand always managed to land on his feet, proving that sometimes a well-timed limp can be a blessing in disguise. As we continue to unravel the saga of Talleyrand, remember that his story is not just one of survival, but of strategic brilliance. He navigated the treacherous waters of French politics with a deftness that was as enviable as it was entertaining. So, as the revolution loomed and the guillotine cast its long shadow over France, Talleyrand prepared to do what he did best, survive and thrive in a world where fortunes could change as swiftly as the tide. As the revolution loomed and the guillotine cast its long shadow over France, Talleyrand prepared to do what he did best, survive and thrive in a world where fortunes could change as swiftly as the tide. Step 1 in this game of political hopscotch was the Estates General of 1789. Picture the scene, a gathering of France's 3 estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners intended to address the kingdom's financial crisis. It was like trying to patch a sinking ship with a band-aid, but don't let that fool you into thinking it was all for naught. Talleyrand, ever the opportunist, knew this was his moment to shine, or at least to stay dry. As a member of the clergy, Talleyrand was part of the First Estate, but he wasn't about to let that box him in. He played a pivotal role in the National Assembly, helping to reshape the political landscape like a master sculptor with a block of marble. His pièce de résistance, the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790, a controversial attempt to bring the church under the control of the state. It was like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, but Talleyrand, ever the pragmatist, saw it as a necessary evil, a way to curb the church's power while filling the state's coffers with much-needed funds. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. The civil constitution was about as popular as a skunk at a garden party. It alienated clergy and faithful alike, with many a bishop and priest denouncing it as heresy. But Talleyrand, always one step ahead, foresaw the inevitable fallout. On February 13, 1790, he took the bold step of resigning from his bishopric, trading his cassock for a more secular sartorial choice. This was no mere wardrobe change. It was a strategic retreat, a way to distance himself from the impending ecclesiastical storm. It was as if he could read the political weather like a seasoned meteorologist. Talleyrand's knack for self-preservation was truly put to the test as the revolution descended into chaos. The Reign of Terror, that notorious period from 1793 to 1794, was like a national game of heads or tails. Except the stakes were your neck. While the guillotine claimed thousands, Talleyrand managed to keep his head firmly attached to his shoulders. How? By making himself scarce. As the heat intensified in Paris, he made a strategic exit stage left, setting sail for the United States in 1794. It was the ultimate power move, one that underscored his ability to read the room and make a graceful exit before the pitchforks came out. Landing in Philadelphia, Talleyrand found a country that was fresh off its own revolution, albeit with less decapitation and more declarations of independence. While he was technically in exile, he wasn't exactly roughing it, far from it. With his considerable charm and diplomatic skills, he mingled with the American elite, even rubbing shoulders with none other than George Washington. Imagine that dinner party conversation. Two political titans, one a symbol of liberty, the other a master of political survival, trading insights on the art of governance. But Talleyrand wasn't just in America for the social scene. He was biding his time, waiting for the revolutionary fervour in France to cool. And it did, eventually, with the rise of the Directory in 1795, a regime that was slightly more stable than a house of cards on a windy day. Sensing an opportunity to return to the game, Talleyrand packed his bags and headed back to France in 1796, ready to re-enter the political fray. His American sojourn had been a calculated risk, but one that paid off handsomely. By the time he returned to France, the revolution had chewed up and spat out many a political figure, but Talleyrand emerged unscathed, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. His ability to adapt and reinvent himself was nothing short of remarkable, a testament to his understanding that in politics, as in life, survival often depends on knowing when to stand your ground and when to make a strategic retreat. As we delve further into Talleyrand's life, it's clear that his story is one of strategic brilliance and deft manoeuvring. He navigated the treacherous waters of revolutionary France with a skill that was as enviable as it was entertaining. So, while many of his contemporaries met their fate at the end of a guillotine's blade, Talleyrand was busy laying the groundwork for his next act, proving once again that in the world of politics, timing is everything. And as we'll see in the next chapters of his life, Talleyrand's timing was nothing short of impeccable. And just like that, Talleyrand was back in the game, ready to tango with the new political powerhouse in town, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, if you think this was a classic buddy movie setup, think again. Their relationship was less Lethal Weapon and more X-Files, a mix of mutual benefit and mutual suspicion, with a side of strategic manipulation. Napoleon, the Corsican upstart with a flair for conquest, had the charisma of a rock star and the ambition of a megalomaniac. Meanwhile, Talleyrand had the subtlety of a chess grandmaster and the survival instincts of a cockroach. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, or at least a force that could reckon with just about anyone else. Upon his return to France, Talleyrand wasted no time in worming his way back into the corridors of power. By 1797, he was appointed foreign minister, a role that was practically tailor-made for his talents. His job? To navigate the tumultuous waters of post-revolutionary Europe, a task akin to juggling flaming swords while riding a unicycle. But if anyone could pull it off, it was Talleyrand. His approach was simple: keep France's enemies at bay, keep its allies close, and keep Napoleon's ego well fed. One of Talleyrand's first big moves was orchestrating the Treaty of Amiens in 1802. Now, let's be clear, calling this a peace treaty is kind of like calling a ceasefire a long-term solution. It was more of a breather, a chance for everyone involved to catch their breath and reload their muskets. The treaty brought a temporary halt to the war between France and the United Kingdom, giving both nations a chance to regroup. Talleyrand knew it wouldn't last. His prediction skills were sharper than a guillotine's blade, but he also knew that even a brief pause could be leveraged to France's advantage. The Treaty of Amiens was a diplomatic high-wire act, and Talleyrand was the one holding the balance pole. He managed to convince Britain to recognize the French Republic and to withdraw from various Mediterranean territories, all while keeping a straight face. The treaty was a testament to Talleyrand's ability to play both sides of the fence, an art form he'd been perfecting since he first donned a cassock. Of course, the peace was as fragile as a porcelain teacup at a toddler's tea party, but it was enough to give Napoleon the breathing room he needed to consolidate power and set his sights on his next conquest. Speaking of Napoleon, his relationship with Talleyrand was a study in contrasts. The emperor saw himself as a military genius destined to reshape the world, while Talleyrand viewed himself as a pragmatic strategist, content to work in the shadows and pull the strings. Napoleon was the rock star, strutting on the world stage, while Talleyrand was the manager in the wings, ensuring the show went off without a hitch. It was a partnership built on mutual need rather than mutual respect, and it worked, at least for a while. But let's not sugarcoat it. Talleyrand was also a master manipulator. He had the uncanny ability to tell Napoleon exactly what he wanted to hear, while simultaneously steering him in the direction he wanted him to go. It was a delicate dance, one that required the finesse of a ballet dancer and the cunning of a fox. Talleyrand understood that Napoleon's Achilles' heel was his insatiable ambition, and he wasn't above exploiting it for his own ends. He was the puppet master, subtly pulling the strings while Napoleon charged headlong into battle. Of course, such a relationship couldn't last forever. Napoleon's ambitions grew ever larger, and with them his paranoia. Talleyrand's influence began to wane as the emperor became increasingly distrustful of those around him. The final straw came in the form of the disastrous invasion of Spain in 1808, a move that Talleyrand had vehemently opposed. When the whole enterprise predictably went south, quite literally, it was Talleyrand who took the fall. Napoleon accused him of treachery and stripped him of his ministerial position. But here's the kicker. Talleyrand had seen it coming. He'd been quietly laying the groundwork for his exit strategy, ensuring that his network of alliances remained intact. While Napoleon fumed and ranted, Talleyrand slipped into the background, biding his time and waiting for the next opportunity to present itself. It was a classic Talleyrand move: let the storm pass and emerge unscathed on the other side. It's tempting to view Talleyrand as a Machiavellian villain, always one step ahead and pulling the strings, but the reality is a bit more nuanced. He was a man of his time, navigating a landscape of shifting alliances and political intrigue. His ability to adapt and survive was born out of necessity, not malice. And while he certainly had his fair share of enemies, he also had an uncanny knack for making friends in high places. In the end, Talleyrand's relationship with Napoleon was a microcosm of his entire career, a balancing act between ambition and pragmatism, between loyalty and self-preservation. It was a testament to his understanding that in politics, as in life, the only constant is change. And as the winds of fortune shifted once again, Talleyrand was ready to adapt, proving yet again that in the game of survival, timing is everything. As we continue to peel back the layers of his life, remember that Talleyrand's story is not just one of political maneuvering, but of human resilience in the face of ever-present uncertainty. As Napoleon's empire crumbled like a stale croissant, Talleyrand was already plotting his next move, poised for yet another grand entrance onto the European stage. Enter the Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815, where the victors of the Napoleonic Wars gathered to divvy up the spoils and redraw the map of Europe. It was like a diplomatic version of Survivor, except instead of tropical beaches, they had opulent ballrooms, and instead of immunity idols, they had treaties and alliances to win. Talleyrand, representing a defeated France, wasn't even supposed to have a seat at the table. Yet, through a combination of charm, cunning, and sheer audacity, he muscled his way into the negotiations. Imagine a party crasher who not only gets in but ends up DJing the event. That's Talleyrand for you. Against all odds, he managed to position France not as a vanquished foe, but as a key player in maintaining the balance of power. His strategy? Play the old game of divide and conquer, a classic maneuver that never goes out of style. With the major powers, Britain, Austria, Russia and Prussia jostling for dominance, Talleyrand did what he did best. He sowed discord and suspicion among them. He deftly pointed out that if one power gained too much territory, it could upset the delicate equilibrium of Europe. France, he argued, was essential in keeping the peace, a bit like claiming a fox as necessary for guarding the henhouse. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, and he played it to perfection. The Congress of Vienna was a spectacle of negotiation, with each country vying for its slice of the continental pie. Yet, Talleyrand's true genius lay in his ability to make himself indispensable. He brokered deals like a seasoned auctioneer, ensuring that France retained its pre-revolutionary borders and even gained some territory, including the strategic Rhineland. It was as if he'd convinced the other powers to let him keep the last slice of cake, all while complimenting them on their generosity. The Rhineland was no small prize. Its location on the Rhine River made it a crucial economic and military asset, giving France a foothold in Central Europe. Talleyrand's success at Vienna was partly due to his skillful manipulation of alliances. He formed a coalition with the British and Austrians against the Russo-Prussian bloc, playing on their fears of Russian expansion. It was the diplomatic equivalent of playing chess on a board where everyone else was playing checkers. His ability to switch allegiances with the ease of changing a pair of socks meant he was always aligned with the winning side. This chameleon-like quality was both his greatest strength and his most notorious trait. Now, about Talleyrand's reputation as a turncoat, it's not entirely unearned, but it's also not the whole story. Yes, he had a habit of switching sides when it suited him, but this was less about betrayal and more about survival. In a world where political fortunes could change overnight, Talleyrand's flexibility was his lifeline. He understood that in the ruthless arena of European politics, loyalty was a luxury few could afford. His maneuvers were pragmatic, not personal, driven by a keen understanding of power dynamics rather than any particular ideology. The Congress of Vienna wasn't just about redrawing borders, it was about setting the stage for a new order in Europe. The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars left the continent in need of stability, and Talleyrand's negotiations helped lay the foundation for a century of relative peace, known as the Concert of Europe. This was no small feat, considering the chaos that had preceded it. By ensuring that France was not isolated or overly weakened, he preserved its status as a great power. It was like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, a trick only the seasoned diplomat could manage, and let's not forget the economic angle. Post-war Europe was a financial mess, with economies shattered and treasuries drained. For Talleyrand, securing a favourable position for France meant not only political influence but also economic recovery. The access to the Rhineland's resources, coal and iron in particular, was a boon for French industry, setting the stage for future prosperity. Talleyrand recognised that political power was inextricably linked to economic strength, a lesson as relevant today as it was in the 19th century. Yet, while Talleyrand was celebrated for his diplomatic triumphs, he also had his share of detractors. To some, he was the quintessential opportunist, a man who would sell his soul, or at least his principles, for the right price. But in the cutthroat world of European politics, where ideals often took a back seat to pragmatism, Talleyrand's actions were neither unique nor particularly shocking. He was simply better at the game than most, with a knack for turning adversity into advantage. As the Congress of Vienna wrapped up, Talleyrand's legacy was cemented. He had managed to secure France's place in the new European order, proving that even a defeated nation could wield influence with the right man at the helm. His ability to turn the tide, even when the odds were stacked against him, was nothing short of remarkable. And while the romantic image of the suave diplomat is certainly appealing, it's the harsh reality of his political acumen that truly stands out. Talleyrand's story, however, doesn't end here. His career was a testament to the art of reinvention, a reminder that in politics, the only certainty is change. As Europe settled into its post-Napoleonic groove, Talleyrand would continue to navigate the shifting sands of power, always ready to seize the next opportunity. In the grand tapestry of history, he is a figure both revered and reviled, a man whose legacy is as complex and multifaceted as the era he helped shape. So, as we prepare to delve into the final act of Talleyrand's life, remember that his tale is one of cunning and resilience, a saga of survival in a world where few managed to keep their heads. With the Congress of Vienna behind him, Talleyrand was ready for whatever the future held, secure in the knowledge that he had once again landed on his feet. And in the turbulent world of 19th century politics, that was no small accomplishment. As Talleyrand stepped away from the Congress of Vienna with a sly grin, the world was his diplomatic oyster, shucked open and ready for the taking. But let's not get carried away with the image of him as a wily old fox, forever scheming in the shadows. While Talleyrand's career was undoubtedly a masterclass in political survival, his later years were more about solidifying a legacy that was as complex as it was controversial. First, let's address the elephant in the room, the eternal question of whether Talleyrand was a man of principles or merely a man of opportunities. Spoiler alert, it's complicated. Talleyrand operated in a world where the line between right and wrong was as blurry as a Monet painting, an era where switching allegiances wasn't just a tactic, but a means of survival. It was a world where the guillotine was the ultimate critic, and staying ahead of the blade required a certain moral flexibility. In the final act of his life, Talleyrand continued to play the game with the same finesse that had defined his earlier years. Take, for instance, his role during the Bourbon Restoration. When the monarchy was restored in 1814, Talleyrand was right there, ready to lend a hand, or rather, a pen to, the new regime. He served briefly as Prime Minister under King Louis XVI, a position that allowed him to wield influence once more. But here's the kicker. Talleyrand wasn't some die-hard monarchist. His allegiance was to stability, not to any particular ruler. For him, monarchy was just another card in the deck, one to be played when the moment was right. Now, let's talk about Talleyrand's supposed legacy as a rogue diplomat. It's tempting to romanticize him as the quintessential anti-hero, a figure who thrived on chaos and intrigue. But in reality, Talleyrand was less of a rogue and more of a realist. His actions were dictated by a keen sense of practicality, not by a desire to sow discord. He understood that diplomacy was as much about compromise as it was about conviction, and he excelled at the former. This was a man who could make a deal with the devil if it meant securing peace, or at least a temporary ceasefire. The myths surrounding Talleyrand's cunning are both deserved and exaggerated. Yes, he was a master strategist, capable of outmaneuvering his opponents with ease. But he was also a man who understood the art of patience, the value of waiting for the right moment to strike. His legacy is a testament to the power of timing, of knowing when to hold 'em and when to fold 'em. In the cutthroat world of 19th century politics, this was a rare and valuable skill. Economically, Talleyrand's impact was equally significant. He recognized the importance of economic stability in maintaining political power, a lesson that remains relevant in today's world. His efforts to secure the Rhineland weren't just about territorial gain, they were about ensuring France's economic future. The region's resources, coal and iron, were vital to France's industrial growth, providing the foundation for a burgeoning economy. Talleyrand understood that true power lay not just in military might, but in economic strength, a notion that was ahead of its time. So, was Talleyrand a genius, or merely an opportunist? The answer lies somewhere in between. He was a man who thrived in uncertainty, who saw the chaos of his era not as a barrier, but as an opportunity. His ability to adapt and reinvent himself was nothing short of remarkable, a testament to his understanding of the ever-changing nature of politics. In a world where loyalty was a fleeting concept, Talleyrand's pragmatism was both his greatest asset and his most enduring legacy. In reflecting on Talleyrand's life, one must ponder the moral ambiguities that defined his career. Was he a villain or a visionary, a traitor or a tactician? The truth is, he He was all of these things and more. Talleyrand's story is a reminder that history is rarely black and white, that the figures who shape our world are often as flawed and complex as the events they influence. His legacy challenges us to reconsider our definitions of success and failure, to question the fine line between genius and opportunism. As the years went by, Talleyrand's influence gradually waned, but his impact on modern diplomacy remained. His ability to navigate the treacherous waters of international relations set a precedent for future generations of diplomats, proving that the art of negotiation was as much about psychology as it was about politics. In a world that often values power over principle, Talleyrand's career serves as a reminder of the enduring importance of pragmatism, of the need to balance ideals with realities. In the end, Talleyrand's life was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the capacity for reinvention and renewal in the face of adversity. He was a man who defied the odds, who refused to be defined by his circumstances, and who left an indelible mark on the world of diplomacy. His story is one of survival and success, of a life lived on the edge of history, where the only constant was change. As we close the chapter on Talleyrand, remember that his legacy is not just one of cunning and calculation, but of courage and conviction. He was a man who dared to dream in a world that often crushed those who dared to do so. And in the grand tapestry of history, Talleyrand's thread is one of vibrant colour and intricate design, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to adapt and thrive in even the most challenging of circumstances. The year was 1815, and while the rest of Europe was busy mopping up after Napoleon's final curtain call at Waterloo, a little bundle of potential chaos was being delivered in a place you probably can't pronounce, Schönhausen. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, young Otto von Bismarck entered the world, presumably with a glint in his eye and a future full of geopolitical chess moves. Of course, back then, nobody expected the squirming infant to grow up and reorder Europe with the finesse of a maestro conducting a symphony of iron and blood. Bismarck's early years were a mix of privilege and provincial simplicity. Born to a noble family, Otto was a junker, a term that sounds like it should be describing a vintage car rather than Prussian aristocracy. The von Bismarcks had land, they had the title, and they had the expectation that young Otto would uphold the family name. But even as a boy, he displayed a knack for being more of a firecracker than a foot soldier in the aristocratic parade. You know the type, the kid who'd rather rewrite the rules than follow them, even if it meant a little singed hair along the way. In the cosy confines of Schönhausen, Otto was a bit of a handful, which is a polite way of saying he was probably the kind of kid who made his tutors earn their keep. And while his formal schooling began at the Plumont Institute, a prestigious boarding school in Berlin, Otto was less interested in the curriculum and more fascinated by, let's say, extracurricular activities. His academic record was more about the lessons he taught in diplomacy, like negotiating himself out of trouble, than any particular scholarly brilliance. Fast forward to Otto's university days, and it becomes clear that our future Iron Chancellor had an early talent for the kind of diplomacy that would later define his career. He attended the University of Göttingen, where he spent a glorious year sharpening his wit and swordsmanship, a necessary skill for someone who found himself in no fewer than 27 duels. Yes, 27. Imagine needing a separate calendar just to keep track of your dueling appointments. While most students were cramming for exams, Otto was perfecting his skill in not getting skewered. This was less about noble honour and more about a young man's practice in conflict resolution, albeit with a slightly aggressive flair. Bismarck's university days weren't all about dodging blades, though. He was also quite the social butterfly. Picture a young Otto, glass in hand, regaling fellow students with stories that would later become the stuff of legend. He knew how to work a room, a skill he would later use to charm and manipulate Europe's elite. But it wasn't all charm and charisma. Bismarck's professors often found themselves exasperated by his antics. His academic endeavours were less of a priority than his social ones, which led to more than a few exasperated sighs from the faculty. Yet, despite the academic detours and the occasional bender, Otto did manage to graduate. With his formal education behind him, Otto was expected to settle into a respectable career, perhaps in law or civil service. But Otto von Bismarck was never one to follow the beaten path. Instead, he preferred to carve his own way, a trait that would serve him well as he manoeuvred through the labyrinth of European politics. His early postings were in the Prussian civil service, where his reports were peppered with the kind of candour that could easily ruffle feathers. His superiors might have wished for a little less honesty and a bit more decorum, but Otto was never one to sugarcoat the truth. Bismarck's formative years were a tapestry of contradictions. He was a man of the world, yet firmly rooted in his Prussian identity. These years crafted the foundation for his later life as a diplomatic colossus. It wasn't just the life of duels and drunken escapades. It was a time when Otto absorbed the complexities of human nature, political manoeuvring, and, most importantly, the value of strategic patience. These lessons would later become the cornerstone of his diplomatic doctrine, which he would wield like a sword, or perhaps more accurately, like a scalpel. As we close this chapter of Otto's life, one thing becomes clear. The young man who once revelled in parties and provoked duels was already rehearsing for the role of a lifetime. He would soon become the puppet master of European politics, but not before leaving a few more professors scratching their heads and a few more opponents licking their wounds. Otto von Bismarck was on his way to becoming the diplomatic genius we remember today, a man who could turn the tide of history with a well-placed word or a masterful silence. And all of this began in the unlikely setting of 19th century Prussia, with a boy who seemed as interested in mischief as he was in mastery. But oh, what a master he would become! And so, with the reckless exuberance of youth behind him, Otto von Bismarck stepped onto the grander stage of political shenanigans like a conductor ready to orchestrate his first symphony. The year was 1847, and the winds of change were rustling through the corridors of power in Prussia. Bismarck, now a freshly minted member of the Prussian Landtag, the state parliament for those of us not fluent in 19th century political jargon, was ready to make his mark. Think of this period as his political boot camp, where he honed his skills in navigating the labyrinthine world of Prussian politics. It was here that Otto began his charm offensive, a campaign that was less about winning friends and more about influencing people. A political influencer before Instagram made it cool. Bismarck was a bit of a paradox. On one hand, he was the quintessential conservative, fiercely loyal to the monarchy and sceptical of the liberal movements gaining traction across Europe. On the other, he was a shrewd operator who understood the necessity of adapting to the shifting political landscape. He wasn't just another aristocrat in a frock coat. He was a strategic visionary who saw the potential of using the tools of his adversaries to strengthen his own position. This duality made him both adored and reviled, a man who could inspire loyalty and loathing in equal measure. But let's not sugarcoat it. Bismarck was not exactly winning any popularity contests. His speeches were often fiery, his rhetoric sometimes bordering on the incendiary. He was the kind of guy who would drop truth bombs like they were going out of style, much to the chagrin of his more reserved colleagues. Picture him in the Landtag, eyes glinting with conviction, as he dismantled opposing arguments with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. He was the political equivalent of that friend who tells you your haircut was a mistake, but somehow you can't help but appreciate the honesty. Then came 1851, the year Bismarck truly began his ascent. He was appointed as the Prussian envoy to the German Confederation in Frankfurt. Now, calling it an envoy role might sound like a glorified errand boy, but don't be fooled. This was Bismarck's proving ground, a place where he could flex his diplomatic muscles and test his mettle against the best and brightest of the German states. And flex he did. He quickly realized that the key to success wasn't just about following orders, it was about outsmarting everyone in the room. Here, Bismarck's wit and cunning came into full play. He wasn't just playing checkers while everyone else was playing chess, he was inventing an entirely new game. Bismarck's time in Frankfurt was a masterclass in political maneuvering. He formed alliances, broke them with the dexterity of a card shark, and then reformed them when it suited his needs. His strategy was simple, yet effective, keep everyone guessing. One day, he'd be the friendly neighbour, sharing a cup of sugar. The next, he'd be the cunning fox, plotting his next move. He was the original political frenemies trope personified. And while many of his contemporaries were busy writing long-winded treaties, Bismarck was busy rewriting the rules of the game. Now, let's talk about the infamous Bismarck's breakfast meetings. These gatherings were the stuff of legend, not because of the breakfast itself, though I hear the pastries were decent, but because of the strategic brilliance that unfolded over those early morning tables. These were not your average casual brunches. They were meticulously orchestrated affairs where Bismarck would gather key political figures, butter them up with croissants, and then proceed to outwit them before they'd even had their second cup of coffee. It was like watching a master chess player move his pieces while everyone else was still figuring out how to set up the board. These breakfasts became a crucial element of Bismarck's diplomatic toolkit. They were unofficial, yet pivotal, informal, yet instrumental. It's said that more alliances were forged and more rivalries cooled over those breakfast tables than in any official meeting room. Bismarck understood the power of personal diplomacy, the kind that couldn't be captured in a memo or a telegraph. He knew the value of a well-timed nod, a strategic pause, and occasionally a perfectly delivered quip that disarmed even the most staunch opponent. But let's not get carried away by the romance of it all. Bismarck's rise wasn't just a result of charm and wit. It was underpinned by a deep understanding of the economic and social forces at play. He was acutely aware of the growing tensions between the industrializing north and the agrarian south of Germany. He understood how railroads, factories, and the burgeoning middle class were reshaping the landscape. This wasn't just a game of political chess. It was a complex web of economic and social dynamics that Bismarck navigated with the precision of an acrobat on a tightrope. Bismarck's charm offensive wasn't without its missteps, though. He had a knack for making enemies as well as allies, a skill that would both haunt and help him throughout his career. His uncompromising stance often rubbed people the wrong way, and his bluntness could be a double-edged sword. But in a world where political survival often meant being the last one standing, Bismarck was more than willing to wield that blade. As his career in Frankfurt progressed, Bismarck's reputation grew. He became known not just as a diplomat, but as a master strategist, a puppeteer pulling the strings of European politics. His ability to anticipate his opponent's moves was almost preternatural, earning him the grudging respect of friend and foe alike. This was no small feat in a time when Europe was a cauldron of political intrigue and shifting alliances. And so, as the 1850s drew to a close, Otto von Bismarck was no longer just a promising young politician, he was a force to be reckoned with. His charm offensive, with its breakfasts and backroom deals, had set the stage for his next act, a meteoric rise to the pinnacle of power. But that, dear listeners, is a story for another day. As we pause here, with Bismarck poised to become the architect of a new European order, remember this: in the game of politics, charm is a powerful weapon, but strategy is the key to victory. Stay tuned, because the best, or perhaps the most cunning, is yet to come. As the curtain rose on the 1860s, Otto von Bismarck was poised to conduct his most ambitious symphony yet, the unification of Germany. Now, if you think herding cats is tough, try uniting a patchwork of 39 independent German states, each with its own agenda, culture, and, let's face it, ego. But Bismarck, ever the political maestro, was ready to do just that, and he had a plan that was less about grand speeches and more about deft maneuvers and strategic bluffing. Bismarck's diplomatic dance was nothing short of a waltz mixed with a tango. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 was his first major move in this high-stakes game. Now, quick geography lesson. Prussia and Austria were the two heavyweight champions of the German-speaking world, and they were about as friendly as cats in a sack. Bismarck knew that to unify Germany under Prussian leadership, Austria had to be sidelined, and what better way to do that than through a short, sharp conflict? The war itself lasted a mere 7 weeks, like an especially intense summer fling, and ended with the Treaty of Prague. Prussia emerged victorious, and Austria was effectively shown the door from German affairs. The victory wasn't just a military triumph, it was a masterclass in diplomacy. Bismarck had cleverly isolated Austria by securing the neutrality of other key players like France and Italy beforehand. He'd effectively told them, "Stay out of this one and I'll owe you a favor." And they did, because who doesn't love a political IOU? But let's address the elephant in the room, Bismarck's so-called blood and iron rhetoric. It's the kind of phrase that gets history buffs all misty-eyed, imagining Bismarck as a steely-eyed warrior poet. In reality, the quote was more about industrial strength and military readiness than actual bloodshed. Sure, Bismarck believed in a strong military who didn't at the time, but he was a pragmatist at heart. His true genius lay in achieving goals with minimal conflict, proving that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword, especially when the pen can also sign treaties. With Austria out of the picture, Bismarck set his sights on France. Enter the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, a conflict that was less about territorial disputes and more about national pride and political necessity. France, under Napoleon III, was the European equivalent of the popular kid at school who just realized they're not going to be prom king. Bismarck, ever the opportunist, saw an opening to rally the German states around a common enemy. It was classic Bismarck: create a crisis, then solve it with such flair that everyone forgets you started it. The war was a resounding success for Prussia and its German allies. The French were routed, Napoleon III was captured, and Paris found itself under siege. Bismarck's diplomatic prowess was on full display at the subsequent peace negotiations. The Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871 not only imposed harsh reparations on France, but also ceded the territories of Alsace and Lorraine to the newly declared German Empire. The war cost France 5 billion francs in reparations, a hefty sum that was like handing over your life savings and then some. While the new German Empire was a testament to Bismarck's strategic brilliance, it came with a cost. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, for instance, left a bitter legacy that would haunt Franco-German relations for decades. It was a classic case of winning the battle, but sowing the seeds for future conflict. But hey, hindsight is 20/20, and at the time, Bismarck was riding high on his newfound glory. He'd unified Germany, and he'd done it with a blend of diplomacy, cunning, and just a dash of military might. Now, let's debunk another romantic notion, that Bismarck was some kind of lone wolf, reshaping Europe through sheer willpower. In reality, he was a master of alliances, a political networker before LinkedIn made it a thing. He spun a web of treaties and agreements that kept the peace in Europe for decades. The League of the Three Emperors, the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, and the reinsurance treaty with Russia were all part of his grand design to maintain balance and avoid encirclement. But let's not pretend Bismarck's alliances were all sunshine and roses. They were more like the geopolitical equivalent of frenemies. Each ally was a piece on Bismarck's chessboard, carefully positioned, but never fully trusted. His treaties were often short-term, renewed only as needed. Like a Netflix subscription, you cancel and re-up based on the latest show. It was all about keeping rivals guessing and maintaining the upper hand. And here's a fun fact. Bismarck was known for his love of secrecy. He'd negotiate treaties privately, sometimes even without informing his own government. This cloak-and-dagger approach earned him both admiration and resentment. He was the ultimate puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows, ensuring that no one fully understood his next move, except perhaps his pet dachshund, who likely heard more state secrets than most of the German parliament. As the German Empire solidified, Bismarck's domestic policies took center stage. He was a conservative at heart, but pragmatic in practice. His social reforms, including health insurance and pensions, were designed to placate a restless working class and stave off the growing tide of socialism. It was a classic Bismarckian move: give a little to keep the peace, a strategy that sounds eerily familiar to any parent trying to negotiate bedtime with a toddler. But Bismarck's genius wasn't just in what he did, it was in what he avoided. Despite the militaristic aura, he was averse to unnecessary wars. His policies were about stability, not conquest. He understood the economic realities of warfare, the cost of soldiers, the disruption of trade, the toll on national psyche. For Bismarck, war was a tool of diplomacy, not an end in itself. In the end, Bismarck's era was one of contradictions. He was a conservative who enacted social welfare, a militarist who preferred diplomacy, a nationalist who balanced international alliances. His legacy is a complex tapestry of triumphs and tensions, alliances and animosities. But as the 1870s came to a close, one thing was clear. Otto von Bismarck had redefined the map of Europe, proving that in the grand game of politics, sometimes you have to play both chess and poker to win. But don't get too comfortable, because with Bismarck, the game was always just beginning. And so, with Germany unified and Bismarck at the helm of his freshly minted empire, the real work began. Being the first Chancellor of the German Empire wasn't exactly a walk in the park, more like a stroll through a minefield while juggling flaming torches, but if anyone could handle the heat, it was Bismarck. The man was a political octopus. navigating multiple fronts with an ease that seemed almost unfair to his contemporaries. Let's dive into the Kulturkampf, which sounds like a heavy metal band, but was actually Bismarck's cultural clash with the Catholic Church. The term itself means culture struggle in German, and struggle they did. See, Bismarck had a bit of a control issue. He didn't like sharing power, especially not with the Pope. At the time, Catholics made up about a third of the German population, and their loyalty to the Vatican was seen as a threat to national unity. So, what did Bismarck do? He launched a campaign to reduce the Church's influence, thinking he could sideline the Pope with the same deftness he'd used to sideline Austria. The Kulturkampf was marked by a series of laws aimed at curbing the Church's power. Priests were required to be educated in state-approved schools, civil marriage was made mandatory, and the Jesuits were given the boot entirely. But here's the rub. Bismarck underestimated the tenacity of the Catholic community. The whole affair turned into a political quagmire, with Bismarck flailing like a man trying to swat a fly with a sledgehammer. In the end, the Kulturkampf was more of a headache than a victory, forcing Bismarck to backtrack and make peace with the Vatican by the late 1870s. It was a classic case of biting off more than he could chew, and it left him with a political hangover that no amount of aspirin could cure. Now, as for Bismarck's domestic policies, they were a curious blend of progressive reforms and Machiavellian strategy. He wasn't exactly the poster child for social welfare, but he was savvy enough to know that a contented populace was less likely to revolt. Enter his pioneering social insurance programs, the first of their kind in the world. In the 1880s, Bismarck introduced health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions. These weren't just altruistic gestures to make society a better place. They were strategic maneuvers designed to outflank the rising socialist movement. Bismarck was essentially saying, why march with the socialists when you can get your benefits here, no strings attached? His health insurance program covered medical treatment and paid sick leave for workers, a revolutionary idea at the time. The accident insurance ensured workers would be compensated if they were injured on the job, and the old age pensions provided support for retirees. By 1889, the old age pension system was in place, offering a safety net for those over the age of 70. It was like dangling a carrot in front of a restless working class, tempting them to stay loyal to the state rather than rallying behind the socialist banner. But let's not mistake Bismarck for a benevolent grandfather figure. These policies were as much about consolidating power as they were about improving lives. They were designed to create a dependency on the state, ensuring that the workers' loyalty lay firmly with the empire. It was political chess at its finest, give the people just enough to keep them satisfied, but not so much that they start getting ideas about true democracy. Speaking of democracy, Bismarck's relationship with the Reichstag was the political equivalent of a love-hate sitcom. He found himself constantly at odds with the parliamentary body, a group he saw as little more than a necessary nuisance. Bismarck preferred to conduct politics with a strong hand and a direct line to the Kaiser, rather than through the messy business of parliamentary debate. To him, the Reichstag was a room full of squabbling children, and he the exasperated parent trying to maintain order. His methods of dealing with political rivals were nothing short of unorthodox. Bismarck was known for his ruthless manipulation of political allegiances, switching sides as easily as one might change a pair of socks. He'd make alliances with the centre-left one day, only to pivot to the Conservatives the next, leaving everyone guessing which way the wind would blow. It was the kind of political theatre that would give even the most seasoned spin doctor a run for their money. One of Bismarck's favourite tactics was to exploit divisions within the Reichstag to push through legislation. He was like a political MacGyver, using whatever tools were at his disposal to achieve his ends. When faced with opposition to his policies, he'd simply find a new ally or create a crisis that made his solution seem like the only viable option. It was political jiu-jitsu, using the opponent's weight against them, and it worked more often than not. Yet for all his cunning, Bismarck was also a man who understood the limits of power. He recognized that the economic landscape of the time was changing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and Germany was transforming into an economic powerhouse. Between 1871 and 1890, the production of pig iron increased from 0.5 million to 4.5 million tons. The economy was booming, and Bismarck knew that economic stability was key to maintaining political control. The Iron Chancellor, as he was affectionately dubbed, was never one to shy away from using economic policy as a tool of governance. He implemented protective tariffs to shield German industries from foreign competition, a move that was as much about strengthening the domestic economy as it was about consolidating political power. By protecting nascent industries, Bismarck was ensuring that the German economy would grow strong and self-sufficient, a vital component of his vision for a unified and powerful state. But let's not forget Bismarck's personal charm, or lack thereof. While he was a master of backroom deals and diplomatic finesse, he wasn't exactly known for his warmth. His relationship with Kaiser Wilhelm I was famously frosty, a dynamic that could be best described as, "it's complicated." Bismarck viewed the Kaiser as a figurehead, a man who should be seen and not heard. While Wilhelm I's content to let Bismarck run the show, his successor, Wilhelm II, would prove to be a different story. But that's a tale for another time. For now, let's focus on the man himself. Bismarck was a paradox, a leader who wielded power with an iron fist, but understood the importance of a velvet glove. He was a man who could charm a room one moment and bulldoze it the next, a political force of nature that left a lasting impact on the world stage. His policies were as much about shaping the future as they were about maintaining the status quo, a balancing act that required both vision and pragmatism. As we stand at the peak of Bismarck's career, it's important to remember that his legacy is not just one of conquest and unification, but of innovation and adaptation. He was a man who understood the power of ideas and the importance of timing, a leader who could see the forest and the trees. And while the path he forged was not without its pitfalls, it was one that reshaped the course of history in ways that continue to resonate today. So, as we prepare to delve into the final act of Bismarck's story, remember this: in the game of politics, there's no such thing as a permanent victory, only a series of strategic retreats and advances. Bismarck knew this all too well, and his ability to adapt to the ever-changing landscape of 19th century Europe is a testament to his enduring genius. Stay tuned, because the Iron Chancellor's tale is far from over, and the twists and turns that await are sure to keep us on the edge of our seats. Bismarck's tale was far from over, but like all good stories, it was reaching its inevitable climax. The 1880s were a decade that saw Bismarck at the height of his powers, but also sowing the seeds of his own decline. The Iron Chancellor was navigating a rapidly changing political landscape filled with economic upheavals and shifting alliances. It was a time when the old certainties were being questioned, and Bismarck, despite his formidable intellect, found himself increasingly at odds with the world he had helped to create. First, let's talk about Kaiser Wilhelm II, the young monarch who ascended to the throne in 1888. If Bismarck was the weathered captain of a sturdy ship, Wilhelm II was the eager young officer itching to take the wheel. Their relationship was rocky from the start. Wilhelm, with his bombastic personality and love for grand gestures, was a stark contrast to Bismarck's calculated pragmatism. The Kaiser was like a teenager who'd just gotten the keys to a brand new car and was itching to take it for a spin, while Bismarck was more like the cautious parent who'd rather stick to the speed limit. Wilhelm II's vision for Germany was one of imperial grandeur and assertive foreign policy, a stark departure from Bismarck's careful balance of power. Bismarck saw war as a last resort, a tool to be used sparingly and only after every diplomatic avenue had been exhausted. Wilhelm, on the other hand, seemed to view it as a means to assert Germany's newfound status on the world stage. This difference in worldview would be a major factor in Bismarck's eventual downfall. The cracks in their relationship widened as Wilhelm II began to assert his authority. Bismarck, who had grown accustomed to wielding considerable power under Wilhelm I, found himself increasingly sidelined. The new Kaiser wanted to be the one calling the shots, and Bismarck's influence began to wane. It was a classic case of generational conflict, with the seasoned veteran clashing with the youthful upstart. The political landscape was shifting, and Bismarck, once the master of manoeuvring, found himself caught in the crossfire. Bismarck's dismissal in 1890 was the result of a perfect storm of political missteps and personal grudges. Wilhelm II, eager to establish his own legacy, saw Bismarck as an obstacle rather than an asset. Bismarck, for his part, was not one to back down easily. He clashed with the Kaiser over a range of issues, from foreign policy to domestic reform. The final straw came with the question of social policy. Bismarck, ever the pragmatist, wanted to renew his anti-socialist laws, a move that was opposed by Wilhelm, who saw it as too repressive. Their disagreements culminated in a dramatic showdown, with Bismarck refusing to yield to the Kaiser's demands. Wilhelm, determined to assert his authority, demanded Bismarck's resignation. It was a bitter end to a storied career, and Bismarck, ever the statesman, offered his resignation with a heavy heart. As he left the political stage, the old world of European diplomacy seemed to leave with him. But let's not get too misty-eyed about Bismarck's departure. Yes, he had been a towering figure in European politics, but he was also a man of contradictions. His reputation as a diplomatic genius was well earned, but it's worth remembering that he was not a lone wolf. Bismarck's successes were the result of collaborative efforts, a complex web of alliances and negotiations that involved a host of other players. He was a maestro, to be sure, but his symphony was performed by an orchestra, not a soloist. Take, for instance, his famed system of alliances. The League of the Three Emperors, the Dual Alliance, and the Reinsurance Treaty were all products of careful negotiation and compromise. Bismarck may have been the architect, but he relied on the skills and cooperation of his contemporaries to bring his vision to life. His genius lay not in acting alone, but in orchestrating a grand coalition of interests. And while we're myth-busting, let's not forget that Bismarck's policies were not without their flaws. His Kulturkampf, for example, was a spectacular failure, and his attempts to suppress socialism only served to galvanize the movement. His legacy, while impressive, is a reminder that even the greatest statesmen are fallible, their grand designs subject to the whims of history. As the 19th century drew to a close, Bismarck's influence continued to be felt across Europe. His system of alliances, though eventually dismantled, had set the stage for the complex web of entanglements that would lead to World War I. His domestic policies, particularly his social reforms, laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state, and his diplomatic strategies, a blend of realpolitik and visionary foresight, left an indelible mark on the art of statecraft. In the end, Bismarck's legacy is one of both triumph and cautionary tale. He was a man who understood the power of strategic patience, a leader who could see the long game even as he navigated the immediate challenges of his day. But his fall from grace is a reminder that even the most brilliant minds are not immune to the forces of change. The world moves on, and those who cannot adapt are left behind. As we wrap up this historical journey, it's clear that Bismarck's story is one of complexity and nuance. He was a man who reshaped the map of Europe, a statesman who wielded power with unmatched skill. Yet he was also a man of his time, bound by the limitations of his era and the imperfections of his own humanity. His tale is a reminder that history is not a simple narrative of heroes and villains, but a tapestry of ambition, compromise, and the relentless march of time. So, as we close the book on Otto von Bismarck, let us remember him not just as the Iron Chancellor, but as a man who mastered the art of the possible, even as he grappled with the impossible. His story is a testament to the enduring power of diplomacy, the delicate dance of politics, and the timeless truth that in the grand theatre of history, no one plays their part alone. In the bustling chaos of Rome around 73 BCE, the city was a thriving paradox, the epicenter of power and progress, yet underpinned by an institution as old as time, slavery. Imagine a city where almost 1/3 of the population were slaves. That's right, about 30% of Rome's residents had no personal freedom. They were the invisible gears keeping the Roman machine humming, from household chores to public works, and yes, even as entertainment. And in this strange Roman circus, the gladiators were the rock stars of their time. But let's not get too carried away by visions of glamorous heroes with swords and sandals. The reality was a lot less Hollywood blockbuster and a touch more grim reality show. Gladiators were slaves too, but they had a different kind of spotlight. They fought in arenas to the roar of the crowd, where life and death were separated by the whims of the audience and the thumb of a Roman emperor. The Colosseum might be the iconic image today, but back then, these battles took place in various amphitheatres sprinkled across the Roman Empire, and the objective? To control and entertain. It was a bizarre cocktail of blood sport and societal manipulation. Romans were all about the bread and circuses, distract the masses with entertainment, and keep them from noticing the empire's cracks. Quite the strategy, huh? Enter Spartacus, the man, the myth, but not quite the legend you've seen on screen. The real Spartacus wasn't some brooding, lone wolf hero with a sharp jawline. He was a Thracian soldier, possibly captured and enslaved, and thrown into the gladiatorial life against his will. But before we get too far into the story of his rebellion, let's debunk a few myths, shall we? Forget the image of him as a solitary figure, standing stoically against the might of Rome. Spartacus was a leader, sure, but he was also a man who built alliances and relied heavily on the camaraderie of his fellow fighters. This wasn't some lone knight narrative. It was a team effort, folks. Now, let's talk about the nuts and bolts of Spartacus's world. The gladiatorial games, for all their bloody allure, were a massive public spectacle. They were part of the ludi, or public games, which could last for days and were typically funded by wealthy patrons or politicians looking to gain favour or votes. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of campaign ads, but with way more swords. Tickets were free, but the cost for those who fought was often their lives. Gladiators were trained in special schools known as ludus, where they learnt the art of combat. These schools were part training camps, part prisons, with some gladiators becoming quite famous, albeit as property of their owners. And here's a kicker for you. Despite their status as slaves, gladiators could become incredibly popular. They were the celebrities of their day, with fans, fame, and even their faces on oil lamps and graffiti. A strange twist, right? Being adored by the public, yet owned by another. It was a life lived on the edge, where every match could be your last. And yet, some gladiators embraced this life, either for the glory or the hope of earning their freedom. The Romans even had a term for a freed gladiator, rudiarius. But don't romanticize this too much. Freedom was rare, and the odds were never in their favour. As for Spartacus, his journey from soldier to slave was probably less about personal choice and more about survival. The Thracians, his people, were known for their fierce fighting skills and had a reputation as mercenaries, often hired by Rome itself. But when alliances shifted, as they often did in the ancient world, Spartacus found himself on the losing side. Captured and enslaved, he was sold to a gladiator school in Capua, a town just north of Naples. This was where our story really kicks off. In Capua, Spartacus wasn't just any fighter. He was part of a cohort of gladiators who would become the nucleus of his rebellion. They were a motley crew of different backgrounds and skill sets, united by their shared circumstances and a common goal: escape. And here's where things get spicy. In 73 BCE, Spartacus and about 70 other gladiators made their daring escape from the ludus. Armed with kitchen utensils they swiped from the dining hall. Talk about making do with what you have. It was an audacious start for a movement that would shake the Roman Empire to its core. The rebellion quickly grew as Spartacus and his followers moved through the countryside. Slaves from all walks of life joined their ranks, swelling their numbers to thousands. This wasn't just a band of runaway gladiators. It was a full-blown slave army, challenging the might and hubris of Rome. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Spartacus wasn't just looking for revenge or chaos. He had a plan. He aimed to march his army north, out of Italy, and back to their homelands. Freedom was the ultimate prize. Yet, Spartacus's story isn't just one of escape. It's a testament to leadership and strategy. He masterfully used the terrain, employed guerrilla tactics, and won several key battles against Roman forces. This wasn't some ragtag group bumbling through the countryside. It was a well-organized force that outsmarted the Roman legions more than once. Spartacus wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was redefining what it meant to resist. But let's take a moment to appreciate the irony here. Rome, with its mighty legions and well-oiled military machine, was being outmaneuvered by a group of former slaves. It was a classic underdog story, and like all such tales, it was filled with moments of triumph and tragedy. Spartacus and his followers proved that even the most oppressive systems could be challenged. And that, dear listeners, is where we'll pause our tale for now. Spartacus's rebellion was just getting started, and Rome was about to wake up to a threat it couldn't ignore. As Spartacus and his burgeoning band of rebels continued their audacious escape, they transformed from a handful of gladiators into a full-fledged insurgency that had Rome scratching its helmeted head. Picture this. a ragtag team of runaway slaves armed with makeshift weapons shaking the foundations of the almighty Roman Empire. It's the kind of underdog story that Hollywood loves. Except this time, it wasn't just for show, it was a real-life saga that left seasoned generals trembling in their sandals. So, how did Spartacus, with his growing army, manage to outmaneuver the Romans? Well, let's just say that Rome's response was less swift military genius and more bureaucratic blunderfest. The Roman military, as formidable as it was, had a knack for underestimating the rebels. They believed this uprising was little more than a minor nuisance, a pesky gnat in the grand scheme of things. Their first attempt to quash the revolt was almost laughably inadequate. They sent a small, poorly equipped militia, thinking it would be enough to snuff out the rebellion. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The rebels, on the other hand, were fast learners and quick to adapt. They had no choice but to be resourceful, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Spartacus was no armchair general. He was cunning and strategic, understanding that his best bet was to keep moving, avoiding open battles unless absolutely necessary. His forces used guerrilla tactics, which was more like a game of hide-and-seek, except the stakes were life and death. And get this. While the Romans were busy bickering over who should take charge and how best to handle the situation, Spartacus was busy recruiting. His ranks swelled as more slaves joined the cause, eager for a taste of freedom and a chance to stick it to their overlords. By the time Rome got serious about dealing with the rebellion, Spartacus's army had grown to tens of thousands. They had become a formidable force, something Rome could no longer ignore. But the real irony? The Romans, with all their military might, were caught off guard by the simplicity and effectiveness of Spartacus's tactics. They were used to fighting organized armies in set-piece battles, not this kind of unpredictable mobile warfare. It was like trying to catch smoke with a net, and Rome's attempts to do so were anything but graceful. The Roman Senate, finally realizing they had a full-blown crisis on their hands, decided to send in the big guns, or the ancient equivalent anyway. They appointed a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber to stamp out the uprising. Now, Glaber was no Julius Caesar, and his approach was about as effective as trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose. He thought he could corner Spartacus by blockading him on Mount Vesuvius, effectively trapping the rebels. But here's the kicker. Spartacus and his men used vines, yes, vines, to rappel down the mountain and flank the Romans. Talk about thinking outside the box. This daring escape from what seemed like a certain defeat only fueled the legend of Spartacus. The Romans, meanwhile, were left red-faced and scrambling to explain how a group of former slaves had outsmarted them once again. It was a classic David versus Goliath scenario, except this time David was wielding a gladius and a whole lot of audacity. As the rebellion grew, so did its impact on Roman society. Spartacus wasn't just a thorn in Rome's side, he was a living, breathing challenge to the social order. The very idea of slaves rising up and defeating Roman legions was unthinkable. It was a slap in the face to the Roman elite, who prided themselves on their superior civilization and military prowess. The economic implications were also significant. With thousands of slaves fleeing their masters, the labor force that kept Rome's economy ticking was in disarray. Fields went untended, estates fell into disrepair, and the usual rhythm of Roman life was disrupted. But let's not romanticize Spartacus too much. While his rebellion was a fight for freedom, it was also brutal and bloody. The rebels, in their quest for liberation, often resorted to violence, pillaging towns, and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. It was a war after all, and wars are rarely clean or noble. The Roman response, when it finally came in earnest, was equally ruthless. In the end, Spartacus wasn't just battling Rome's legions. He was up against the very fabric of Roman society, a society that would do whatever it took to preserve its status quo. As we leave Spartacus and his ever-growing band of rebels to continue their march through Italy, one thing is clear. This wasn't just a struggle for freedom, it was a clash of ideologies and a battle for the soul of Rome itself. The story of Spartacus is far from over, and the Roman Empire is just beginning to grasp the magnitude of the threat it faces. So stay tuned, because the saga of Spartacus is about to reach new heights, and Rome is in for one heck of a ride. And so, the saga of Spartacus continues, with Rome increasingly frayed by its inability to contain this audacious insurgency. It's remarkable, really, how a band of escaped slaves managed to become the empire's most vexing problem. But let's not forget the grit and ingenuity that got them there. Quality Spartacus had in spades. The skirmish at Mount Vesuvius was a masterclass in strategic improvisation. Here was Spartacus, facing what appeared to be an inescapable siege by Glaber's forces. The Romans had blockaded all exits, confident they had their quarry trapped like rats. Yet Spartacus and his men turned the mountain's vines into lifelines, scaling down the cliffs to outflank and surprise their besiegers. It was the ultimate "you thought you had me" moment, and it left Glaber with nothing but a red face and a tarnished reputation. This wasn't a one-off trick. Spartacus's ability to exploit terrain and outthink his oppressors became a recurring nightmare for the Roman commanders. Each failed attempt to subdue him only served to embolden his followers and swell their ranks. The victories piled up. The Roman commanders sent to crush the rebellion. Publius Varenus and his deputy, Furius, fell foul of Spartacus's tactics. Varenus, with his 3,000 men, was sent scurrying back to Rome with barely a shred of dignity left, while Furius's forces were decimated. The slapstick nature of these Roman blunders would be comical if the stakes weren't so high. The Senate was beside itself, unable to comprehend how their disciplined legions could be so consistently outmaneuvered by a man they dismissed as a mere gladiator. In the grand theatre of Roman politics, the Senate's frustration was palpable. They'd begun to realize this was no longer a mere slave rebellion. Spartacus was threatening the very stability of the Roman economy and social order. Thousands of slaves were abandoning their posts, and the ripple effects were felt far and wide. The states languished unattended, and the economic machinery of Rome, which depended so heavily on slave labor, started to sputter. The Senate's response was to throw more resources at the problem, a classic case of doubling down on a failing strategy. Yet, each new commander seemed to underestimate Spartacus's resolve and cunning. And here's where the gallows humor comes in. For all their bluster and bravado, the Roman commanders displayed a remarkable talent for spectacular failures. It's almost as if they were competing in a comedy of errors. Each defeat added to Spartacus's legend and further demoralized the Roman forces. The Senate's frustration turned to desperation as the rebellion continued to grow in size and scope. Spartacus was no longer just a thorn in their side. He was a full-blown existential crisis. But let's not get too swept up in the romanticized notion of a noble, liberating crusade. The rebellion was far from a pacifist protest. Spartacus and his followers left a trail of devastation in their wake, razing towns and exacting brutal revenge on those who dared oppose them. It was war, plain and simple, with all its attendant horrors. The rebels were fighting for their freedom, yes, but they were also driven by the primal urge for survival in a world that offered them no quarter. Meanwhile, the Roman military machine, accustomed to the orderly chaos of traditional battlefields, found itself floundering against Spartacus's fluid tactics. Spartacus didn't play by their rules, and that threw them off balance time and again. The Romans were like a heavyweight boxer trying to catch a nimble martial artist, swinging wildly but landing few blows. The rebellion's victories were a testament to Spartacus's ability to adapt and innovate, turning every disadvantage into an opportunity. As Spartacus's forces moved northward, they faced a growing array of Roman legions, each more determined than the last. Yet they continued to outmaneuver their foes, employing a mix of hit-and-run tactics, strategic retreats, and psychological warfare. It wasn't just about brute strength. Spartacus used the terrain to his advantage, choosing battlegrounds that favored his lighter, more mobile forces. He understood that his best chance lay in avoiding direct confrontation with Rome's full might, instead whittling it down one skirmish at a time. The economic impact of the rebellion was profound, with the usual rhythm of Roman life disrupted by the runaway slaves' exploits. The Senate, initially slow to react, finally realized they were dealing with a full-scale uprising. The financial implications were daunting, fields lay fallow, trade routes were disrupted, and fear began to grip the heart of Rome. Spartacus had managed to challenge not only the Roman military, but also its very way of life. Despite the chaos, the Senate persisted in its attempts to quash the rebellion, sending more troops and commanders to try their luck against Spartacus. But with each new failure, the legend of Spartacus grew, becoming a symbol of resistance and defiance against an oppressive regime. The rebellion was now more than just a fight for freedom. It was a statement against the systemic injustices of Rome. The Roman commanders' repeated failures became a source of embarrassment, not just for the individuals involved, but for the Roman state as a whole. Each defeat at the hands of Spartacus was a blow to Roman pride, a reminder that power and prestige were not enough to guarantee victory. The Senate's frustration turned to anger as they struggled to come to terms with the reality that a group of former slaves was making a mockery of their military might. As the rebellion continued to gain momentum, it became clear that Spartacus was more than just a skilled tactician. He was a charismatic leader who inspired loyalty and devotion among his followers. His ability to unite disparate groups under a common cause was a testament to his leadership skills, and it was this unity that proved to be one of the rebellion's greatest strengths. Spartacus wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol of hope for those who had none. But as the rebellion raged on, the Roman Senate knew it couldn't afford to let this challenge go unanswered. They began to marshal their resources, preparing for a final showdown that would determine the fate of Spartacus and his followers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences for both Rome and the rebels. The stakes were high, and the outcome was anything but certain. So, as we leave Spartacus and his band of rebels poised for the next chapter in their epic struggle, one thing is clear. The rebellion was more than just a fight for freedom. It was a challenge to the very foundations of Roman society. And as the Senate prepared to bring its full weight to bear, the world watched with bated breath to see who would emerge victorious in this epic battle of wills. Stay tuned, because the saga of Spartacus is far from over, and the Roman Empire is about to face its greatest test yet. As we move forward in the tale of Spartacus, the Roman Senate finally woke up to the existential crisis unfolding under their noses. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, whose hobbies included buying up entire neighborhoods and, apparently, squashing slave revolts. Crassus was a man who knew the value of a good investment, and this rebellion was a chance to cement his legacy, not to mention earn some major political brownie points. Crassus took over the command with a confidence that could only come from someone who could afford to lose a fortune and still shrug it off. He wasn't just any commander, he was a shrewd businessman who saw this uprising as an opportunity to prove his military mettle. Unlike his predecessors, Crassus didn't underestimate Spartacus. He respected the threat and was prepared to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at it. That's right, because when you're Crassus, you don't just bring a sword to a fight, you bring the whole hardware store. The Senate, having been thoroughly embarrassed by Spartacus's antics, was more than happy to let Crassus take the reins. And so, armed with almost 50,000 Roman soldiers, Crassus set out to do what others had failed to, bring Spartacus to heel. But before the mighty clash could commence, let's talk about the internal drama that started brewing among Spartacus's ranks. Turns out, leading a ragtag army of former slaves wasn't all high-fives and victory parades. Cracks began to show in the unity that had propelled Spartacus to his previous successes. Sure, they were a formidable force, but they were also a diverse coalition of different backgrounds, languages, and motivations. Some wanted to raid and plunder, others yearned for freedom at any cost, and a few just wanted a good fight. Spartacus, for all his leadership skills, struggled to keep everyone aligned. It's like trying to herd cats, except these cats are armed and ready to overthrow an empire. Overconfidence started creeping in too. After a series of victories, some of the rebels began to believe they were invincible. Why not? They'd bested Rome at every turn, and the taste of triumph was intoxicating. But hubris, dear listeners, is a dangerous companion, and the rebels were about to learn this the hard way. Spartacus wanted to push north, out of Italy, but not everyone agreed. Some of his men, drunk on their own success, wanted to march on Rome itself. It was a bold move, but also a strategic blunder of epic proportions. Rome was a fortress, and attacking it head-on was like trying to punch through a brick wall with a feather. Meanwhile, Crassus, with his deep pockets and even deeper ambition, organized his forces with meticulous precision. He wasn't playing around. He implemented strict discipline, reviving the old Roman practice of decimation to keep his troops in line, literally killing every 10th man in any unit that showed cowardice. Talk about a motivational strategy. Crassus understood that to defeat Spartacus he needed an army that feared him more than they feared the rebels. It was brutal, but it worked. Then came the moment when the tide truly began to turn. Crassus, ever the strategist, decided to construct a massive trench and wall across the toe of Italy effectively trying to pen Spartacus in. It was a logistical feat, showcasing Crassus's ability to marshal resources like he was organizing a real estate takeover. This move forced Spartacus into a corner, cutting off his options and testing his tactical prowess to the limit. Yet even cornered, Spartacus wasn't about to go quietly into the night. He attempted to negotiate with pirate mercenaries to secure passage out of Italy, but in a classic case of betrayal, they took his money and left him high and dry. With dwindling options and rising tensions within his own ranks, Spartacus had to make some tough calls. Do they fight their way north, or do they turn and face the might of Rome head-on? While Spartacus grappled with his dwindling fortunes, Crassus was busy running a PR campaign worthy of a modern-day politician. He painted himself as Rome's saviour, the man who would restore order and crush the rebellion. Crassus wasn't just fighting a war. He was crafting a narrative, positioning himself as the hero who would save the Republic. The Senate, desperate for good news, ate it up like they were starving. And maybe, just maybe, they were starving for a victory, that is. The irony here is rich. Here was Crassus, a man who profited from Rome's woes, now stepping in to save it. It's like the fireman who moonlights as an arsonist, cleaning up the mess while secretly enjoying the chaos. But hey, in the cutthroat world of Roman politics, you did what you had to do. Crassus knew that success on the battlefield would translate to power in the Senate, and he was playing the long game. As the walls closed in on Spartacus, the reality of their situation started to hit home. The rebels, once a symbol of hope and defiance, were now trapped in a desperate struggle for survival. Crassus's strategies were working, and the noose was tightening. Spartacus, ever the tactician, knew their only hope lay in one final decisive battle. It was a risky gamble, but then again, his entire rebellion had been a series of audacious bets. So, as Crassus prepared to deliver the final blow, the stage was set for an epic showdown. The Roman might, embodied in Crassus's legions, versus the indomitable spirit of Spartacus and his ragtag army. It was a clash that would echo through the ages, a testament to the power of human will and the harsh realities of a world ruled by force. But this story isn't over yet, folks. The saga of Spartacus still has a few more twists and turns left, and the outcome remains uncertain. Stay tuned as we inch closer to the dramatic finale of this epic struggle between freedom and oppression, ambition and survival. As we gear up for the final act of Spartacus's rebellion, let's set the stage. Crassus, with his legions ready, versus Spartacus, the man who had become a symbol of defiance and hope. But as with all epic tales, reality is rarely as neat as legend. Spartacus knew the endgame was near, and despite his tactical genius, the odds were stacked against him. The final confrontation was set to occur in 71 BCE on the plains of Seleucia. Imagine the scene, two great forces meeting in a battle that would determine the fate of thousands. Spartacus, ever the leader, was said to have slain his own horse before the battle, declaring that if they won, they'd have their pick of Roman steeds, and if they lost, he wouldn't need one. Talk about commitment. Yet, despite his resolve, the battle quickly turned into a brutal affair. Crassus's forces, numbering around 40,000, had the upper hand in terms of discipline and equipment. Spartacus's ragtag army of roughly 50,000 men, though larger, was outmatched by Roman tactics and military cohesion. It was a bloodbath, and the Gladiator army was systematically cut down. Spartacus himself fell in this climactic clash, fighting bravely to the very end. His body was never found, adding a layer of mystery to his already legendary status. The Romans, meticulous in their bookkeeping of death, reported that about 6,000 of Spartacus's men were captured and crucified along the Appian Way, a grim reminder to anyone who might dare challenge Roman authority again. Picture this: 120 miles lined with crosses, a chilling message from the empire that might makes right. The aftermath of the rebellion left Rome with a lot to ponder. The slave economy had been shaken to its core, and the Senate knew they couldn't afford another Spartacus. So, what did they do? Well, they didn't exactly rush to free their slaves, but they did start to tighten the leash, implementing stricter controls and surveillance to prevent future uprisings. The rebellion forced Rome to confront its dependency on slavery, an institution that was both its strength and its Achilles heel. Now, let's talk legacy. Spartacus's rebellion might have been quashed, but his impact was far from over. Over the centuries, he became a symbol of struggle against oppression, inspiring countless movements and revolutions. From Karl Marx to Che Guevara, Spartacus's fight became a rallying cry for those who saw themselves as the downtrodden. And then there's pop culture. Who can forget Kirk Douglas, chin dimple and all, bringing Spartacus to life on the silver screen? The Hollywood version was more about heartthrobs and heroism than historical accuracy, but hey, who doesn't love a good underdog story? That brings us to the myth versus the man. The Spartacus of legend is a lone hero, a gladiator with a cause, standing tall against the mighty Roman Empire. It's a compelling narrative, but the real Spartacus was a savvy leader who knew the power of collective action. He wasn't a solitary figure. He was the head of a multi-ethnic coalition, navigating complex dynamics and leading a de facto army of the oppressed. It wasn't just about personal glory. It was about the possibility of a different world where freedom wasn't just a privilege for the few. In reflecting on Spartacus's legacy, we see how history loves its underdogs. There's something irresistible about the little guy taking on the giant, even if the giant ultimately wins. Spartacus's story reminds us that sometimes the fight itself is as important as the outcome. It's a theme that resonates throughout history, whether it's the American Revolution, the French Resistance, or modern-day protests. The struggle for freedom is a tale as old as time, and Spartacus's defiance echoes through the ages. As we wrap up this saga, let's appreciate the irony of how Spartacus, a man who died fighting against enslavement, became a symbol for those seeking freedom. His story is a testament to the human spirit's resilience and the enduring power of hope. While Rome might have defeated Spartacus on the battlefield, they couldn't kill his legacy. It lives on, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can be challenged by those with nothing to lose. So there you have it, folks. Spartacus, the man, the myth, the legend. A story of rebellion, resilience, and, yes, a touch of romance. Because who doesn't love a good fight for freedom, even if it ends with a dose of harsh reality? Spartacus's tale is a reminder that history is messy, full of contradictions and complexities. Yet, it's these very stories that keep us coming back for more, eager to learn and be inspired by those who dared to dream of a world that could be better. Now, go forth with this knowledge, and may your dreams be as bold as Spartacus's rebellion.